Tonight, the town sleeps under a wind that smells of dust and pine boards cooling in the dark. Somewhere beyond the shuttered saloon, where the piano has long since folded its last song into silence, a single lantern sways along the boardwalk. Its glow falls across boots that do not hurry, across a black coat that never rustles more than the wind allows. The Undertaker moves like someone gathering loose pieces of the night. At the edge of town, under a sign that only says Boot Hill, because it needs no other name, the grass leans and listens. But before he climbs the hill, there is work to be done. In the small room behind the shop front, everything waits in its place. A tin basin, water cold as a coin. Mirrors draped in white so no wandering spirit sees its own reflection. A pine box leaning against the wall, as patient as wood can be. On the workbench, blades catch the lamplight like thin lines of winter sun. The air smells faintly of carbolic, then pine, as though someone has tried to make the evening polite. He ties his cravat as evenly as a man can without a mirror, straightens the ledger on the desk, and sharpens the small knives the way a clockmaker tunes a spring careful unhurried, as though neatness itself could keep death from feeling untidy. Outside, the last door on the street closes with a sound like a page turning, and the town gives him over to the dark, so lower the lights where you are. If the night feels long, stay with this one instead. The story will walk at your pace. Whether you listen through to the final name in his ledger or drift off before the first, neither the hill nor the man who climbs it will mind. And so the night opens like a ledger of its own, one page for the living, one for the dead, and a wide blank margin where the wind writes its name again and again. The lantern's circle moves slowly over doorways, across the edges of fences, over the waiting grass of Boot Hill. Behind each step lies the hush of rooms where clocks tick. Mirrors keep their secrets and shutters breathe with the wind. Ahead lies the work of names and hands, of rituals that make the dark behave itself. It is a journey measured not in miles, but in the quiet weight of each task waiting for its turn. The hour has slipped past the time when a saloon piano remembers the same 5 songs, and the frosted glass on the doors has begun to cloud over from the night air. Down a plank sidewalk where the boards creak like sleepy accordions, the Undertaker ties his black cravat, checks the clasp on the rosary he keeps in his waistcoat pocket, and lays out his tools in the small parlor behind the shop front. The room smells faintly of carbolic and pine. A ledger waits on the desk, leather cracked at the corners, its columns already dated for the night names, causes, belongings, burial plots, and a column for fees that often remains empty. He sharpens the small knives slowly, carefully, the way one tidies a desk before real work begins. He leaves the shop with the lantern and the canvas stretcher, which has a squeak in the right handle. He keeps meaning to oil when the week stops being a week and turns into time, and the streets recognize him because he has the night sewed onto his lapels. Boots clap on the boardwalk, and he looks through the barroom windows the way a man checks the weather, trying to see if the evening has more wind in it. The piano has gone silent, but cards are still being taught important lessons, and the barkeep nods at him the way you nod at a man who comes in to measure, not to drink. He pauses at the sheriff's office where the stovepipe ticks like a cooling cricket, and the deputy squints up from a newspaper that is 3 towns out of date. To be fair, the headlines never arrive in step with the dust. The Undertaker asks about fines, trains, and trouble, in that order. There's been a derailment talked about upriver. There's been a gunfight, the sort that leaves a plume of story and a pebble of fact. The deputy says, might be you'll be called, and the Undertaker says, might be, as if the night had suggested an errand and he is slow to agree. When the rap on the door does come, it is the plain rap of a coroner who is really a dentist, who is really a man, with a badge that says coroner because the town decided he looked good in spectacles. The Undertaker steps to the wagon, the stretcher snug against his shoulder like a stubborn book. The coroner brings the pine box, which is not a coffin but a suggestion. Coffins require time, and time is a luxury item out here, usually stored behind the bar. They rattle out to a trestle where a small crowd has dissolved into a quiet that smells of iron rails and wild onion. The Undertaker keeps his voice low, because low voices weigh less on the living. He sets the lantern where it paints a circle of color on the ground and makes the night seem like a room. He takes his little ruler from the breast pocket, thin as a bookmark, and he notes the wound as if noting a misprint. If the coroner needs formality, there is a small notebook that says inquest, and it is opened as gently as a hymn book in a chapel you did not build. He writes what the town needs to remain convinced it is orderly. Time, place, the roommate facts that share a bed without talking. If a deputy murmurs that a man simply rode poorly into the dark, nobody contradicts him in a voice the night could overhear. Sometimes there is a bribe kept on a breath, the kind of coin that tells a line to turn left instead of right. The Undertaker writes what he is told when it seems to add peace rather than subtract truth. It is not heroism. It is accounting for a town that prefers its balance sheets curious and quiet. People do not often see the back room, which is the heart of a small, well-run storm. 2 basins, a barrel that looks undecisive until it has hot water in it, a shelf of soap that smells like the word lie written in chalk, and a curtain that turns the space into a place. There is a ritual you could draft with a carpenter's square. The Undertaker rolls up his sleeves as though the work might be jealous if he wore cuffs. He shrouds the small mirror that hangs above the washboard because reflections are too talkative. He pins the curtains so they make a clean rectangle of evening. He lays coins, local pennies, army pay, an orphan dime on the eyes because lid and coin have a handshake that says close nicely, please. It is a kind of politeness that does not need to be explained. He breathes evenly, and not just because the work asks for steadiness. The breath seems to bless the air with measure. Hair is combed as if it were a field that could be persuaded. Beards are trimmed to a Sunday argument. Hands are crossed with the care you use to close the lid of a small clock you do not want to start again. If a family has sent a ribbon, it is folded along the palm. If a locket, it rests by the sleeve. If a lock of hair, it is stitched away in a small envelope with initials on the outside and something like certainty on the inside. Sometimes there is no family and the envelope says none in handwriting that tries not to be sentimental. The Undertaker's signature in those cases is a faint pressed line on the shroud where his hands end the work. He does not sign his name on the body, of course. It is just a mark of weight, as if to say, I witnessed, which is a kind of mercy. Embalming, when it comes, arrives from the railroad, the way a new word arrives in a small town, demonstrated by a traveling man who opens a valise to release a future nobody asked for. The Undertaker keeps the formulas in a notebook too small to look dangerous, written in a tidy ottoman of numbers and words. There is zinc chloride. There is something arsenical that makes him suspicious of his own fingernails. There is wintergreen because progress appreciates a mint, and the syringe looks like a metal pen that is a bit too honest. There are days the mixture behaves like grammar and all the parts agree. There are others it is a debate you cannot adjudicate. He understands that color is memory for the living and that a little church wine can return a face to the right paragraph. He murmurs apologies to the departed when he borrows the wine, because it is nice to inform them of the borrowing. If supplies run thin, he bribes the river, scooping cold in a jug until it says something polite back, soaking claws that drape the body like shade. Winter makes everything easier except the walk. He has a stitch he learned from a carpet seller who came west for no good reason except the replacement of one horizon with another. A tiny cross that tucks the mouths quiet into place. There are stitches for the neck when the jostle of the road has made reminders. There is thread that disappears into its job. All of this is written later in the margin of the ledger. which has margins precisely for this. Future him may need the memory of what he decided in an hour when the lamp smoked and the cat refused to vacate the chair. Boot Hill rises above the town like a very patient wave. It is an imprecise place made precise by habit. If you climb there by lantern, you learn something about the economy of steps. The Undertaker walks the path at a softness that pretends to be silence. The wind arrives with a comb and tidies the dry grass. It is not malicious, it has a schedule. Stars look like tacks hammered gently into a dark board, bright as nails. At the hill's brow, he has a schedule too. He cuts turf in an even square, because rectangles look more forgiving in the morning, and he stacks the sod like biscuits to return later to their original addresses. He shoves the shovel into the soil and listens to whether the caliche rings or sulks. There is a sound like crockery breaking far away that tell him how much conversation the earth will allow. If the grave must be deep before dawn, he hires drifters who agree for a cup of coffee and a promise redeemed by noon. If he digs alone, he measures depth with the shovel's throat and hums a bit of a psalm in a key that would not embarrass the dead if they were given to music. Coyotes watch, not for the drama, which they do not credit, but for the gossip, which they do. The Undertaker believes animals believe in routines and not in him. There are tokens. A Catholic verse that wedged in from a mother's letter. A German hymn remembered poorly but with affection. A Cheyenne chant that an Undertaker cannot translate that keeps respectful with pauses. He places small things when small things come his way. A matchbook that still bears the address of a Nebraska saloon. A broken harmonica which he cannot make sing but sets to face the wind so it might remember. A gaming chip placed under the left shoulder, a joke from a card player who asked to be lucky one last time. None of it guaranteed to be recognized by posterity, but perfect for the short distance between today and tomorrow. Names, when there are names, go on small markers like tidily given advice. There's a little plane in his pocket that is as old as he is. He uses it to quiet splinters on the crosses so that hands, if they come, will not be startled by roughness. When he cannot put a name on the wood, he draws a map in the ledger, row, step, stone, a choreography that survives weather better than paint. He hums while he writes, not because the ground is dramatic, but because the act of marking by hand in a book makes a person want to keep time. People think a cemetery is about endings. The Undertaker thinks it is about coordinates and dust, which is to say, knowing where, which is a comfort disguised as arithmetic. Back in town, under lamplight that has no patience for the romance of shadows, the ledger opens its mouth to be fed. He lists boards, nails, bleach, wintergreen, soap, and wages for the drifters in one neat column, carefully separating the word wage from the word donation because the sheriff may read. The sheriff reads slowly, but he reads. He writes two versions of the same story, the one for the sheriff, which is strictly about a brawl that was a brawl, and the one for the coroner, which admits the possibility that a beating might have thought of itself as a fall. He writes both with the same pen because pens do not keep secrets. There is a margin note to see about a new saw because the old one complains like a chair. There is a tiny sketch, almost a doodle, of a playing card brim, not the man's face exactly, just the hat brim he remembers from seeing the body moved from saloon to wagon, shade moving across the features like the minute hand of a clock. He sketches a scar. He sketches the exact tilt of a woman's smile 2 days gone. Not because it is useful, but because the ledger asks for company while it eats numbers. He is not an artist, but he is a mirror that remembers what it has reflected. Sometimes he pauses and counts out fees that will not be paid. A prospector who promised in gold. Later, the later did not happen. A ranch hand whose boss is very sure the hand owed him money in advance. The boss is generous without certainty. The Undertaker has a private column called Sure, which he fills with small yeses when the widow has flour and a daughter with a birthday. He is practical about charity, if you could call being practical about mercy a kind of profession. He staples small receipts to the page with pins that later rust into history. When the page is full, he turns it over and then he glances at the lamp and takes a sip of coffee that has learned to be patient set there, on a saucer where the ring will dry into a circle the color of careful. If you're still awake, the arithmetic of quiet civic life is oddly satisfying. Everyone owes, and the town pays, and in the end, the hill accepts all invoices without complaint. If you're asleep, none of this minding of columns will trouble your dreams. He speaks aloud to the shop once in a while because rooms like words. A long paragraph for the cat, a short sentence for the wintergreen bottle, some narration for the stretcher as if it were a mule. The night outside keeps its hand on the shoulder of the building. When a knock comes at the door, it is usually a soft knuckle made polite by the hour. He answers with a kind of silence that invites people to speak, and then does not interrupt them while they walk their grief around the parlor. It is a skill. The town's unofficial priest, rabbi, and translator. He knows how to convert a fist into a sentence and a sentence into an entry. He writes things down so the wind can't argue with them later. He has a knack for slowing an evening to the pace of a person exhaling, and the paper appreciates being written on at that speed. At dawn, he goes up the hill with a cup of coffee that tastes the way a stove warms a room slowly. Stones have been restless during the night. He writes them on the way, pressing his thumb in the dust to remember he has fingerprints. The grass glitters a little, not from dew exactly, but from a permission the morning gives to all small things. He brushes dust from letters with the back of his glove so the names will not feel lonely. He mutters apologies to a board that has bowed, to a stake that has leaned as if thinking of other careers. He checks the unmarked row, the way a librarian checks the shelf nobody borrows from. Nothing has wandered. The town yawns below him, shutters waking like eyes. He descends ahead of the heat with a small list of errands written in his head, the kind of list that would be ridiculous if it were louder. Buy soap, tie string, stitch ribbon, oil squeak. He is good at small things, which is helpful because most of life, if you measure it correctly, is small things with occasional headlines. There is a mercy he practices that I send large enough to make the minutes write about it. If a stranger asks about a grave and the stranger's words are half-built, he takes them on faith and leads the way slowly, letting the path do some of the explaining. He stands to the side so the stranger can look without feeling observed. He does not correct stories. He adds adjectives. He mends the little gaps where the living have lost a bolt or two, tightening them with ordinary phrases like, "I think this is it," which are more valuable than a sermon when the morning is still thinking things over. If he finds a note left on a grave, the paper weighted by a smooth stone, he slides a second stone onto it in case the wind is especially rhetorical that day. He is not superstitious, but he behaves as if superstition were a neighbor whose fence you do not hop. On his workbench, he keeps a spool of thread that never seems to be used up. It holds in it a lifetime of quiet stitches across small tears that would never make the newspaper. Sewing is quicker than talking. He taught himself the surgeon's knot from a pamphlet whose illustrations looked alarmed. The knot turned out calmer than the drawings. He taught himself the slate's trick of taking chalk and keeping it convincingly, and although you might tempt a moral from that, a town's story is chalked on a hill that will not be wiped clean, it is more restful simply to imagine a board and a hand and the silence in between. He makes tea sometimes instead of coffee because tea asks fewer questions. The sheriff stops by to sign a line the coroner will countersign next week, and the Undertaker hands him the pen with a reminder to press lightly. The pen catches if you try to impress it. They speak about the weather with the seriousness of men discussing law. They inventory nails as if nails vote. The sheriff thinks he has brought news. It is old by the time it arrives, but that is not the point. The Undertaker folds the paper and tucks it beneath the ledger flap as a mother tucks a blanket, and the sheriff leaves, satisfied with his place in the bureaucracy of sunrise. This is how towns run, duty moving on small hinges. Every tool in the shop has a sound it makes to say thank you. The shears say it crisply, the knife stones hum. The broom says it with a long exhale down the boards, pushing sawdust into a small drift that looks like it might be a map of somewhere kinder. He lights the lamp even in daylight when he needs company. He dims it when the sun is brave. He is fond of white shirts that are not exactly white anymore, and of the way the cuffs remember each gesture, a faint gray praising the hands that made it. He cuts his own hair without vanity. He polishes boots because his shine gives the town confidence. He has a small back garden that grows herbs badly and tomatoes loudly. The tomatoes believe in their work the way a choir believes in singing. The herbs merely indulge him. He dries mint to throw off the wintergreen's monopoly, and he hangs lavender because a woman from the railroad swore it kept flies from arguments. It does not matter if it works. The point is the hanging, the soft brushing of sprigs pulled like quiet summer. He brings a sprig up the hill sometimes and leaves it where the wind will have to climb a little bit to take it. You could call it a ritual, but it is more of a hobby for the brief. On certain afternoons, the Undertaker copies names from older, fragile books into the current ledger as though paying down a debt. He believes in redundancy. He likes the feeling of a line rewritten to be safer. The act of copying gives him a companionable slowness. He remembers a mother who paced the plank walk one dawn in a nightgown and boots, and he writes her son's name again just to make sure the paper has not forgotten him. The pen scratches. The cat purrs. The stove ticks. People tend to think history is what you read in newspapers. He suspects history is what you carry forward in decent ink. Night comes again, even if nobody requests it. He tightens the cravat. He tests the lantern's hood. He pats the rosary through the fabric of his pocket to count the familiar beads without looking. The town settles like flour in a jar. Cards are shuffled because hands like rituals. A harmonica tries its luck with a tune that might be a hymn, might be a mistake. In the workshop, the oils are put where they belong, and the syringes pretend to be pens, and the ledger waits like a tame animal that has not forgotten wildness. Through the window, Boot Hill holds its silhouette, the way a thought holds its shape even when you ignore it. There is a knock. It is unimportant whose knuckles found the wood. In this work, knocks are pronouns that refer to a story you have not met yet. He sets down the cup and stands up, smoothing the apron out of reflex more than pride. The lantern lifts like a small moon. The door opens onto another account to be taken, another measure to be measured, another good word, carefully chosen, to be written beside a name. He will go out again, the Nightwatchman of the hill, keeper of last rites and little mercies, with the ledger tucked like a faithful pet against the arm. The boards will creak the way they always do, and the wind will remember his footsteps, and somewhere a coyote will pause as if to listen for gossip. You can follow this if you like, or let it go on without you, because it will. The town will always need tidy stories, and the man with the lantern will write them, with edges soft and mind straight, until morning leans through the window and asks politely for the pen. You might not expect a room full of unclaimed envelopes to sound like the ocean, but it does softly, as thousands of paper shores brush each other and the tide of sorting slides them along in whispery waves. The door latch clicks at dawn, which is really just the night changing its mind, and the postmaster of the dead letter office steps into the pale hum with a key that only sticks if the weather has opinions. He is a tidy man, tidier than the mail, which resists tidy the way hair does in wind. He hangs his hat on the same peg each morning, not because it matters, but because each peg deserves the courtesy of predictability. The air smells faintly of gum arabic and a perfume that no longer remembers the person it tried to impress. A cat blinks from the radiator as if guarding the empire of unforwarded affections. If you're still awake in a few minutes and the lost addresses haven't lulled you into a cozy blur, you're welcome to subscribe to more stories of misdirected envelopes. If not, allow the soft shuffling of paper geography to turn down the lights behind your eyes. The postmaster checks the wall clock out of habit, though he knows its minute hand is 2 letters late, and will remain so until a repair becomes urgent, which is to say, never. He unlocks the big pigeonhole cabinets, which are not for pigeons but for destinies stalled at the corner of hope and handwriting. There are drawers for insufficiently addressed, illegibly addressed, addressed to a street that changed its name during Lent, to occupant but which occupant, and the famous morning stationery with no return. He touches the brass label frames as though greeting elderly neighbors who have politely refused to move. He fills the inkwells. He checks the blotters as a person checks on sleeping children, not for fear, just for routine. He straightens the nibs in a row until they resemble a small regiment resigned to clerical service. He flips open the ledger with its ruled blue lines and enters the date in unspectacular numbers that will someday tell a historian exactly when nothing very dramatic happened. At the back door, sacks arrive in a canvas avalanche. The carriers, rosy and wind-chapped, do not step inside. There is a superstition about the dead letter office, and even the practical man prefers to keep certain doors between himself and the idea of messages that nobody receives. He slices the twine with a practiced move and lets the unclaimed fan out, a snowdrift of attempts at communication that reach the wrong climate. He admires some handwriting the way a gardener admires a symmetrical cabbage. He is not sentimental, but he appreciates competence. On the blotting table, he places a calling card from Mrs. Uchi Purkis. If delivered, be so kind, which is tender in its grammar and firm in its hope. He wears cotton gloves not to elevate the work, but because old ink is an opinionated dye. By 8, the clerks take their stations, small islands on a slow-moving sea. There is Miss Gray, who can decipher anybody's drunken cousin in 3 guesses, and Mr. Peabody, who treats every envelope like an injured bird and every address like a riddle thrown from a moving train. A sign on the wall, politely stern, asks them to refrain from reading personal letters beyond the practical minimum. The sign understands human nature about as well as a sign can. They do not gawk. They observe in the way of weather instruments, recording pressure and direction without judging the rain. The rule is simple and soothing. If you can determine a destination by reasonable inference, send it. If not, annotate your failure in neat script and pass the matter to the ledger. The ledger loves neat failures. A note on a telegram says, "Meet me where the band played last, you fool," which is very romantic and universally unhelpful. A parcel rattles with 2 marbles and a broken brooch, and no other identifiers beyond "Auntie." The one with the lace curtains, which narrows it down to roughly every aunt who ever saw a window. A letter sealed with black wax is not tragic. It is just traditional, and traditions travel well even when the addresses don't. Sometimes there are packets of seeds labeled with good intentions, but no county. Once there is a single glove, left-handed, which proves that half of a thing is as lonely as a whole thing in the wrong drawer. The postmaster begins his morning rounds with the calm of a librarian who has already translated the impatience out of time. He pauses by Miss Gray, who is boiling an address from a postcard in the same town it left, a local who wrote "Mother" next to the green shop. You know the one. And she smiles without looking up, because the "Mother" next to the green shop gambit is a subgenre. He moves on to the cabinet labeled "Return for better instruction," which is a phrase he wishes could be used more often in life. He records the totals for packages whose string tied the knot of their fate too tight. He adjusts the small fan that keeps the blotter's humidity from staging coups. He is, in his physical person, a gentle metronome the room uses to keep its tempo. There is a section for evidence, a modest museum of odd enclosures employed by desperate senders who believe the post would better remember a person if it could also smell, taste, or jingle them. A crust of wedding cake, ancient but not shy. A sachet of lavender that once overperformed and now simply sits. A button with ES carved into it, which describes approximately 5% of people alive. A sliver of coal. An earring without its partner. A twist of baby hair ribboned in blue and failing to point. Each is pinned to a card with a date and a summary little biographies of hope. He allows himself the humorless smile of a man who knows that evidence is only persuasive when it persuades. Most of the time, it waits. He adds a new exhibit, a shred of a store billhead with Hiram's Dry, visible, and no town. He files it under nearly at 9. He opens a tin box that says, in case of fire, which does not contain water, but a list of procedures that prioritize ledgers before anything with sentiment. He sighs, not in grief, just in acceptance of bureaucracy's odd love. He copies out, in a slow, unhurried hand, the numbers for the quarterly report, which will reassure a superior that more than half of the dead letters were resurrected by inference, doggedness, and the universal tendency of people to write their names somewhere on the inside flap. He has a statistic he enjoys. Letters resolved due to interference by bakers. Sacks of flour, sent carelessly, sometimes imprint their bakeries in a lovely dust on the paper. The flour acts as a helpful gossip. He writes the footnote, flour-based epiphany again. By mid-morning, the office indulges in its favorite sport, the geographical detective exercise. An envelope claims it belongs in Springfield, without specifying which Springfield among a legion so numerous that to address a letter there without a state is to describe a drop of water as living in the ocean. Miss Gray deduces the correct iteration by the sender's postmark, the style of S, and a faint smell of hay rather than coal. Another letter requests delivery to the White House with the blue gate near the church, a universal that could be pointed to from any parish lane since the world began. Mr. Peabody traces the paper to a paper mill on the Maine coast and hazards a guess. He is very brave in small ways. The postmaster enters in the ledger his favorite phrase, dispatched on a probable wind. He pauses for coffee which tastes vaguely of stamp gum, and he doesn't mind. The cat relocates to a stack of undeliverable circulars advertising patent remedies. There's a tonic that promised to regulate the spleen, a cordial to render dogs more thoughtful, and a syrup whose chief ingredient appears to be optimism. He writes to the firm, as he always does, suggesting that "to resident of this town" is not a sufficient romance to win a mailbox. Some days the job is mostly convincing paper to meet the world halfway. Some days it is convincing the world that paper has its limits. Late morning brings the delicate work. Opening letters whose addresses have failed loudly but whose contents may whisper a clue. The rules require 2 clerks to witness, and the little knives are sharp enough to remember they are tools, but not so sharp they forget they are used for kindness. He opens a square envelope of thick rag paper and finds inside a sample of cloth the color of a storm over wheat. The note says, "This is the shade for the bridesmaids. Please confirm." He marvels at how the cloth holds the memory of a conversation 3 people forgot to complete, and decides, after studying the watermark, that the letter wants to go to a mercer in St. Louis. A small victory, no trumpets, only a pencil tick on the right line. He opens another bill paid in exact coins, taped to the paper with such vigor that removing them would tear the arithmetic. He rewraps the coins with thread and writes a note explaining to the future that good intentions are adhesive. There is a microtheater of human nature in every stack. A postcard of Niagara Falls written upside down, because the writer was either playful or in a hurry, and the address smears where a raindrop judged it. A note that says, "I forgive you, but not too much," with adequate street, insufficient city, which is either a parable or just Tuesday. A parcel that clucks when shaken someone has mailed 2 live chicks with air holes tenderly punched and an address too hopeful. The postmaster moves that one quickly, not out of excitement, but because Mercy has a schedule. He pens expedite for reasons obvious and peeping, which satisfies both the ledger and his sense of style. At noon, the light through the tall windows softens from pewter to cream. The clerks eat sandwiches with careful hands, so crumbs do not propose friendship to glue. They swap tiny facts with the tone of people exploring a museum in low voices. Did you know, Miss Gray says, that there are 29 ways to write the word county and still omit the county? Mr. Peabody has discovered that a certain French cologne persists on envelopes far longer than any promise written inside. The postmaster bites his bread and notes, as he has for years, that people write soon with more ambition than skill. He writes it in the margin, an observation no one asked him to record, and which delights him anyway. Afternoon is for maps, the large ones mounted on rollers that squeak like thoughtful mice. He draws a thin red thread between towns that often confuse one another, Lebanon to Lebanon and back again. He maintains a private cartography of Mistress versus full-hearted attempt. He adds footnotes about streets renamed after local heroes whose heroism did not include towing the post. He maintains a chart of holiday congestions, the times when good cheer overwhelms zip and code. He organizes a drawer of rubber stamps whose vocabulary is bureaucratic poetry. Forwarded in doubt, better directed, not at this number, box closed without explanation, and the elegant reason stated on reverse, which promises mystery and then delivers it on the back like a shy magician. There is a weekly auction of undeliverables that resisted both patience and inference. He hates and respects it. Hats nobody claimed will find new heads. Books inscribed to Dearest, who turned out to be a moving target, will be read by other dears. A parcel of buttons in the shape of moons will live on somebody else's cardigan. The postmaster turns over to the clerk the list of lots and writes beside it a gentle reminder to remove any letters tucked into the linings, the love notes used as packing material, which is both thrifty and risky. He thinks of it as a kind of harvest, not of sorrow, not even of luck, just of redistribution, an economy as circular as the cancellation stamp. He keeps a cabinet for the things that cannot be auctioned because they ask for reverence. There is a crude wooden cross whittled from orange crate slats, bound with twine, no address, no stamp, just intention. There's a ring sewn into a hem that felt like a wish and will not be unwished. There's a lock of hair, not baby now, just hair that might one day be married to an address by some small detective miracle. On a gray day, he opens the cabinet and makes sure the ring catches light. He considers this a form of keeping. His afternoon rounds include the foreigners, as the ledger calls them, letters trying to cross oceans armed with only a first name and faith. He admires the way distant time zones breathe inside paper, how a sheet from Trieste crinkles differently than one from Dublin. He flips through dictionaries of cities and invents affectionate nicknames for the ones with too many vowels. He sends a package toward a village in Wales he cannot pronounce but can draw from memory by the way it is spelled like offensive consonants. He stamps via best guess and feels professional. There is inevitably comedy. A very earnest boy has addressed a letter to the man who invented kites, and the postmaster contemplates sending it to China, to Benjamin Franklin's grave, to a shop in Marylebone with an authoritative awning. Instead, he sends it to the boy's own schoolmaster with a brief note suggesting the library. He writes it neatly. He cannot help it. Neatness is his dialect. Another envelope is addressed to that tall fellow at the train, which Mr. Peabody says is clearly George because all Georges are tall if seen from a distance. They laugh without noise and then decide to file it under Return to Fate. Sometimes the dead letter office becomes a chapel. A letter to a soldier comes back stamped deceased, and the return address is smudged with the sender's careful tears. The postmaster rewrites the address down to each tiny serif so the letter can at least make its way home. Another envelope contains a pressed violet and the sentence, "It is spring here. Is it there? And there is no return at all." He places it in a drawer marked "Gentleness Required" and hopes gentleness, by being labeled, might arrive. As the light leans toward evening, he totals the day's resurrections. 3 dozen letters returned to life by painstaking guesswork, a handful dispatched to the correct Lebanon, 2 chicks forwarded to a farmer with a note to puncture the holes more liberally next time, a bracelet reunited with its town by the scent of lilac soap, which is morally indistinguishable from magic. He logs the failures with the same respectful ink he uses for triumphs. He does not scold paper. He knows paper is simply the stage on which human messiness rehearses. He sweeps. The broom whispers across the floor like a rumor that refuses to sharpen into news. He oils the rollers. He caps the inks with little cork hats. He straightens the blotters so their corners sit in a modest square, a geometry of day's end. On his way to the peg, he pauses and rereads the wall sign asking for restraint with content. He tips a private hat to the office, which has done remarkably well at being curious without being cool. He pats the cat, who does not wake, because cats follow a calendar that forgives. Night in the dead letter office does not make the room less full. It simply makes the paper more audible, the way night makes a river sound like it has more water. The postmaster listens for a minute, because listening costs nothing and pays in calm. He closes the ledger with a gentle thump that says, "We will begin again," and the ledger, which believes in repetition as a philosophy, agrees. He writes one last note in the margin, "Address found by Flower, 3rd instance this month," and underlines Flower twice because it amuses him that bread should aid the post. On the way out, he holds the door a second longer than necessary, because perhaps some lost sentence will leap the threshold and find its subject. He locks the door, lets the key murmur in the lock, and puts the key back into the pocket that knows its shape. In the corridor, the building breathes, the kind of end-of-day exhale you also hear in libraries and churches and kitchens. He walks home along a street that has kept the same name since Tuesday, which is as much stability as a person can reasonably request. The next morning will be indistinguishable and perfect in its indistinguishability. More Springfields. More mothers next to green shops. More flower epiphanies and shy violets and addresses that forgot to include a town because they believed the post had second sight. He will hang his hat on that peg, the faithful one. He will pin evidence gently to its cards. He will send messages toward lives that did not expect them, and let the remainder rest kindly where label and ledger can keep them company. A letter, after all, is just a folded room with a door. He is the caretaker who tries every key slowly, without giving up, and closes each door softly even when nobody answers. If you're still listening, this will go on well, orderly, and compassionate until paper gives way to sleep, and the addresses take the long route to dreams, where delivery is always attempted again in the morning. You might not expect the quietest place in a frontier town to be the Undertaker's parlor, but it is even when the saloon next door is arguing with itself, and the freight wagons outside are inventing new forms of squeak. The evening begins with the lamp. It takes him 2 strikes to coax the wick into that small yellow oval that makes death look like a decision. He polishes the chimney with a sleeve that already forgot it was clean, and then he does the inventory of his pockets, the way a sea captain counts ropes. Key to the back shed. Pencil shaved to an honest point, folded leather notebook smelling of soap and arithmetic. He sharpens the shears just enough so they feel brisk, but not opinionated. He checks the tin of carbolic without actually opening it, because he will know if it is empty by the weight, and because he prefers not to invite the smell into conversations that did nothing wrong. The floorboards speak 3 syllables under his boots. Old wood only knows 3, and the sign on the door humbly promises services in a script that curls at the ends like a cat's tail. On the table are cards arranged in neat stacks that look like quiet guests at a meeting. One stack is requests from the deputy he writes in a crisp hand that likes commas. Another stack is messages from relatives who plan to arrive without fail on the next stage, which is a phrase with a generous sense of scheduling. A third contains bills from carpenters, gravediggers, and one man who claims to rent shovels by the hour, though his sense of hour is clearly seasonal. The Undertaker straightens them because paper likes to be believed. He warms the cork in the inkwell between his fingers, so it slides open with the good manners of a door held for someone. If you're still awake by the time he reaches the part about zinc chloride and wintergreen, you may subscribe for more gentle procedures. If you drift off before then, the lamp will attend to the subscription on your behalf. He nuts a black cravat plain, not severe, and tucks a rosary into his vest pocket where it clicks against the watch. The watch gains 1 minute a month, a confidence rarely seen among timepieces in the territory, and he trusts it even on days when the sun seems to have been issued by mistake. The ledger lies open on the counter like a pond when the wind forgets to ruffle it. The first page of the evening is already ruled into columns. Name when known, 'cause when known, belongings when any, burial plot when available, fee when possible. He has learned, without ceremony, that nothing encourages accurate bookkeeping like polite handwriting. He writes slowly. He knows the town is made of people who prefer to be done quickly and correctly, and he finds that the second part is easier if he expands the first the way a baker lets dough rest. When the knock comes, a quick rap made by someone who owns a hat with a brim wide. Enough for rain, it is always the same brief exchange. The Undertaker opens the door as if to a neighbor, because that is usually what it is. The deputy leans in, glances at the lamp as if to confirm that light exists, and gives a few facts the way a man gives directions in a town with one street. Train, derailment, mine, fall of rock, gunfight, remedial, fever, persuasive. Sometimes he brings the coroner's note as a favor. Sometimes a fine rattles in the deputy's pocket like a reluctant coin. After the door closes, the Undertaker washes his hands even if he has touched nothing but paper. A courtesy to whoever will next shake it. He takes the pine wagon down from its hookout back, checks the canvas stretcher, and makes sure the lantern works in the wind. He keeps small change in a tiny bag under the seat because grief is famous for miscounting. There is an economy to the way he moves, a choreography practiced until the steps lose embarrassment. He knows which board on the porch catches mud. He knows which hinge will sigh in a way that sounds judicial and which will not. He knows that the saloon mirror, if you look at it the wrong way when the doors are open, puts your hat on someone else. He keeps a pocket notebook for small observations that will later become small improvements. Today's entry, nails in slap boxes to be stored head up. Gravity is persuasive. Beside it he writes, purchase broom with shorter handle. Long broom exaggerates mistakes. The cat, which insists on living everywhere, watches him with the lazy seriousness of a judge in recess. Back inside, the room wears a different kind of quiet. It has the professional feeling of a kitchen kept ready at 11 at night. He fills the tin basin and sets out the soap, the razor, the comb with the missing tooth missing, not from neglect but from cooperating with the truth that nothing is intact forever. He drapes muslin over the mirrors because it is merciful to ask them to rest. He checks the wintergreen bottle that came to town with the traveling demonstrator, whose patter was so soothing that half the street nearly bought the embalming kit even though they had no immediate plans. The formula still works well enough out here where trains arrive, introducing new climates. He sets out the little coins for eyes with the quiet humor of a man who once used buttons and learned that someone always recognizes the buttons. Washing is not hurried. Tin basin. Rain barrel water warmed until it is companionable, hands crossed on the chest while he soaps the cloth. He follows a ritual that is not anyone's ritual officially, yet feels older than his coat. Heel trimmed, beard combed, hair laid in a part that might have been chosen on a kind day. If there is a family, he looks for a locket, a ribbon, a lock of hair in an envelope. If there is no family, he folds a square of muslin and slips it into the pocket, a signature of presence. He rarely speaks while washing, but once, when the wind was making the eaves whine like lost tin whistles, he said softly to no one, "We will now perform the necessary civility." And for a moment the room felt like a courtroom where everybody had agreed to be kind. The table at the back holds the other instruments. Small pump, hand-sized and stubborn. Arterial syringe with its practiced shrug. Suturing needle curved like a comma that wants to take a breath. He knows the formulas not the way a chemist knows them, but the way a cook knows how dough behaves when it is listening. Zinc chloride to keep honesty from becoming haste. Wintergreen to encourage the room to remember the season even when it does not. Arsenical blush to return not youth, not life, just the memory of color because memory is good company. When supplies run thin, he borrows wintergreen from the apothecary and returns it with a pie. It is not a transaction so much as a neighborhood. It is possible to be meticulous without making a fuss. When the river ices over and journeys slow, he is stitched discreetly so a jostling coffin does not invite remarks from the road. When the mud rises and the town becomes a collection of islands connected by stubbornness, he mixes the preservative a trifle stronger, because the mile to Boot Hill becomes 3, and the logic of formulas respects shoe leather. Some nights he pauses with the syringe in hand, and thinks that civilization might simply be the habit of doing the next step cleanly. He cleans his hands again. He notes the time in the ledger as if time were a cooperative witness. Out at Boot Hill, the grass is combed by a wind that must have misread the year. The hill sits above town because somebody long ago decided that rest should have a view. He visits at night when stars are bright as nails. No metaphor, honestly like nails, and coyotes confess their opinions on the far side of the ridge where opinions echo better. He cuts turf and sets it aside like a neat hairpiece. The soil is a biography of what blew through town last month. Shale bites shovels, sand collapses with a sigh, caliche rings like an old plate. If the grave needs to be deep before dawn, he hires drifters with coffee and the promise of coins that make friendly noises. If no help can be found, he digs alone, measuring depth with a shovel's throat, because the measuring rod is backed by the ledger and the shovel is perfectly conversational about distance. The rows are not strictly rows. They have to negotiate with rocks that do not read maps. He keeps a hidden plan of the place in his head long after the rain has made the wooden markers forget their letters. For the marked, there are tokens. A Catholic verse muttered in a voice that is respectful, but possibly a bit Lutheran. A German hymn hummed by a ranch hand, who knows the tune but not the words, which turns the hymn into an excellent hum. A Cheyenne chant shared in whispers by a friend, accompanied by a quiet silence from all strangers who understand that certain things are not for them to narrate. For the unclaimed, he places something to keep storms from scattering the story. A matchbook, a broken harmonica reed, a gaming chip under the left shoulder, a private kindness. Names are often pencil, and pencil is brave, but pencil has weather to contend with. He writes each step, each stone, in the ledger where memory is conserved in ruled lines like small fields. When dawn surprises the ridge and the sky puts on colors that seem extravagant for a place that still owes the carpenter for last month, Astor the Undertaker smooths the turf and brushes dust from boots with the end of the rope. He recites nothing official. He is not a judge. He is more like a notary between this world and the next, witnessing signatures no one watches him witness. He checks the posts for the climbing vines the school teacher planted last spring in a tender act of attempted shade. He picks a bit of glass from the path because children climb and glass tells old jokes about feet. He glances back at town where Smoke is practicing mourning. Back in the parlor, the ledger waits like a well-behaved dog. By lamplight, he adds the practical items no poetry ever remembers. Coffin boards purchased from the sawmill that does not enjoy exact change. Muslin bought by the yard from a peddler who swears by his own product like a man selling his reputation. Bleach that arrived in an unlabeled bottle with the confidence of a preacher. He writes the fee, and if a family is not ready for the arithmetic of sorrow, he takes something else instead. A promise to mend his porch, step a basket of eggs formal enough to be considered, exchange a favor of water when the town well is appointed to be political. He keeps receipts for everything because someday a distant clerk will ask, and he would like to answer with the calm of a man presenting lined paper. There is a drawing page in the back of the ledger where, between entries, his pencil makes small portraits, not faces. He does not ambush faces. He sketches brim of hat bent at the same angle as its owner's opinion. He sketches a scar heading east across a knuckle and deciding halfway to head south. He sketches the precise tilt of a woman's smile that said she forgave trouble only up to the edge of supper. These sketches are not art. They are anchors for names that may blow loose. He labels them in code he alone understands, not to be secret, but to be careful. Sometimes a stranger stumbles in with a question that is really a need to sit somewhere quiet. The Undertaker makes tea that tastes unthreatening. He answers with comfortable facts. Yes, boo. Hills Rakier towards the northwest. No, we no longer use the old cedar planks for coffins because they split when the weather thinks dramatic thoughts. Yes, the cat does in fact belong to everyone and therefore no one. He speaks with an evenness that keeps panic from catching on coat sleeves. He is the town's Nightwatchman, not in the sense of walking the streets with a club, but in the sense of remembering peculiar things at 2 a.m, so that somebody else does not have to. His accounts are precise and merciful. He writes in the margin when someone argues about a bill. Paid in promises. To be redeemed by weather. He writes in another margin when a widow gives him a tin of buttons as a deposit. Buttons accepted. Currency is what people believe in. He dots every I emphatically as if pinning the word to the page. Sometimes the deputy arrives with a story so tangled it wants to tie itself in bows gamblers, a knife that retired into a floorboard, a judge who decided. He was also a poet, and the Undertaker listens, nods at the appropriate commas, and then extracts the one fact the ledger requires. The ledger, like a cow, digests what it is fed and returns it usefully. Night again. He sweeps sawdust into a discreet hill, because wood insists on leaving souvenirs. He oils the hinges that have become opinionated. He checks the lantern and the pine wagon, the kind of nagging habit that keeps more things than lanterns from going out. He sits a moment in the chair by the door not to rest, precisely, but to let the day sort itself like poker chips. He counts the tokens, the hymn, the chant, the chips, the glass, the eggs. He is not a philosopher, but he understands that mercy shows up in odd denominations. There is sometimes a knock after midnight. It is a quiet knock, like someone tapping on the edge of a thought. He relights the lamp. Every relighting is a friendship renewed, and opens the door to a person who needs the skills of a man who can turn confusion into sequence. A ranch hand has brought in a hat and a question. A schoolboy has brought in a box lid and a note that says, in careful script, "Please keep for when needed." A woman has come to ask whether the Undertaker will, in some future day, remember that her sister loved the color the sky makes when the wind leans west. He says yes without writing it down because he will. He has a sense of which facts need ink and which need a nod. One peculiar duty is the maintenance of the town's collective forgetfulness. He keeps 2 ledgers, the official one with names and fees and practicalities, and a thin private book labeled, "What We Will Not Say." In it he records a detail when saying it would make no one kinder, that somebody Sorrow began 3 months before anyone noticed that the hired man could read better than he admitted that the gambler asked the Undertaker to examine a watch because he had no friend to ask. The book is not for publication. It is a map of how to treat a town gently in conversation. On a very good day, he adds nothing. Dawn, again. He worms his hands around a cup of coffee so strong that it seems to have been brewed from the idea of coffee rather than the beans. He reads the page he wrote last night and finds no reason to edit the syntax. He notes that although the wind had opinions, the lantern did not care. He brushes the dust from the parlor floor with a wish that dust could be persuaded to settle as a hobby. He arranges the chairs in their preferred eccentricities. One angles toward the stove because its back leg is shy. Another prefers to look at the window. He hangs the key on the nail that fits it best. He expects the day to be ordinary, which here is a word that means full. Outside, the town tries on mourning the way a person tries on a coat before buying it. The baker's chimney exhales something persuasive. The blacksmith argues with an anvil in a dialect entirely composed of sparks. The school teacher rings the bell once in the empty yard because bells like to practice. A stage rattles in, having left part of its conversation in the ruts up the road, and a traveling dentist hangs out a sign suggesting that courage can be rented by the half hour. In this busy orchestra, the Undertaker is the quiet instrument that tells everyone else where the measure begins. If you are still tracking this gentle progress, you may smile at how many small secrets and smaller efficiencies make a frontier town coherent. A rope hung to dry exactly where the breeze behaves. A shovel kept inside to discourage frost. A ledger with a ribbon bookmark that looks like humility but is a system. If you have grown drowsy and the room encourages it, you can let your mind curl up where the lamp light pools on the worn countertop. The Undertaker will keep the rest of the watch. He will walk when walking is required, and he will write when words need to stand somewhere respectable. He will wash, trim, comb, fold, stitch, and hum, not because it changes destiny, but because it is correct to be careful with endings. Far from drama, he proves the usefulness of very small certainties. Coins for eyes arranged parallel to the brow because parallel feels organized. Muslin cut square. Wintergreen used sparingly so it does not attempt to be a personality. Turf replaced with the same decorum with which it was moved. Tools cleaned and put down where hands will remember them in the dark. An hour written exactly, a fee written kindly, a note added in pencil that says, family to arrive when weather is permissive. He brings his lamp to the threshold, looks out at the quietly quarrelsome horizon, and lets the flame lean slightly toward the wind without granting it authority. The night keeps to its lane, the parlor keeps to its light, and the town, unconcerned with eloquence, sleeps a little more soundly knowing that one person is awake, keeping gentle count of everything that ends and putting each ending in order so the morning can begin again with fewer rough edges. You might not expect the quietest, tidiest handwriting in town to belong to a man who spends his nights with sawdust and lantern smoke, but that is exactly where it lives. The Undertaker finishes polishing the lamp chimney with a corner of his sleeve that has given up on being fancy, and the yellow circle of light settles over the counter like a warm coin. He has a way of beginning the evening by listening to the room. The clock murmurs. The floorboards explain their opinions, one at a time. Even the scissors on the tray clear their throats in that small metal voice that says they are ready to behave. Outside, boots click along the boardwalk. A piano practices the same 6 brave notes, and somewhere a mule argues with an empty barrel and wins. He opens the top drawer where his pocket notebook waits and writes with the deliberate calm of a man who enjoys a straight margin. Lamp trimmed, water warning. Nails counted, 29 in the coffee tin, 8 more in my vest. He does not need to write the nails, but the act of writing them makes the day align, the way a comb persuades stubborn hair that order is not a trap. The evening round is always the same and always a little different. He He touches each tool as if they were small animals that prefer to be reassured. The bone saw gets oiled, the shears tested on a thread-clean bite. No drama, the needle, curved like a patient moon, checked for birth. The tin of carbolic is weighed in the hand rather than opened. One learns the weight of cleanliness, the way a baker knows flour by the sound it makes landing in the bowl. A length of muslin is folded into thirds and then into quiet. He cleans the glass on the display case because Jess likes to write ungrammatical messages with its finger. On the counter, the ledger lies open to the new page, ruled in columns, so even they might take vows. Name, when known, 'cause if it would like to be said aloud. Belongings, which often fit easily into a poem. Plot, marked on a sketch of the hill that looks like a thumbprint in pencil. Fee, where he writes either numbers or just as respectably. The word arranged. If you happen to remain awake long enough for the column titled Miscellany, feel free to subscribe. If you drift away before we reach it, the room will sign your name on the list with excellent penmanship. There is a knock at the door that knows exactly how hard a knock needs to be believed. The deputy looks both overworked and underinterested, which is a stable combination. He delivers information in the tone of a man reporting the weather to people who can see it. Train platform, one misjudged step, far past your horse that lost patience with the discussion. Alley behind the barber, a disagreement between men who believed in the same card. He sets a folded paper on the counter with unexpected gentleness. Sometimes he slides over a small envelope with coins that have the feel of official apologies. The Undertaker nods, writes, nods again, because nodding twice makes even bad facts feel domesticated. When the door closes, the lamp seems larger. He tightens the wick the way a music teacher corrects a timid note. On the street, two voices accelerate towards a song that will not be remembered. He performs his second ritual, an inspection of the wagon. The pine shell gleams by moonlight, not polished, exactly, but respected into smoothness. The canvas stretcher is folded with corners meeting like very polite neighbors. He lifts the lantern, checks for fuel, finds that someone himself again has thought ahead. On the shelf above the pegs, his hat waits with the brim shaped for rain he may not meet, and the coat that smells of lye and pine sap forgiveness. He owns a rosary that makes a small clicking as he walks. Some nights he wears it to steady the rhythm. Some nights he leaves it on the nail because quiet is already present and does not require staffing. A cat follows him to the door, stops, decides against the adventure, and returns to guard the piano. The Undertaker smiles about this, an almost invisible event, and pulls shut the door that keeps the room warm for his return. Inside again, he settles behind the counter where the stories come without voices. It is not exactly a business and not exactly a ministry. It is something like a library with a very narrow topic. He sharpens the pencil to a fine, reliable edge and writes without flourish. He puts a small daub beneath each name. No one knows why. He does not, most likely. It looks a little like a candle flame. It makes the column feel less alone. He sips a coffee that has achieved a consistency somewhere between beverage and plan. The night has the patience of a ledger. The town, with its tin roofs and speculative lumber, calms itself slowly, and the Undertaker, having set the light, lets the hours start their work. The room in which he prepares the unprepared dead is not grim. It is meticulously ordinary, as if the word tidy had been hired to hold the door. On the shelf sit bars of lye soap that smell like decisions. A tin basin waits beside the barrel for warm water, not hot, because skin prefers moderation even after negotiations are over. He drapes muslin across the mirrors to ask them to rest. Reflections do enough during the day. Coins for lids are ready in a saucer, edges smoothed by years of being polite. He places the comb, the scissors, the razor at right angles, as if the tools were learning geometry. The act of washing is not complicated and never rushed. Breath done, then heel trimmed, beard corrected into a version that suggests the wearer had indeed intended to be tidy when the time came. Hands crossed or not, depending on how stubborn a life was when it left. On a nail hangs a ribbon with a spare key. Beside it, a box for keepsakes, a lock of hair tied with thread, a locket with someone else's face, a folded note that once sorted a quarrel, and now sorts nothing. If there's family, he labels the envelope with a square A hand, even when the pencil tries to become tender. If there is not, he tucks in a square of muslin, for the principle that pockets should not end empty. There is comfort in the small dignity of these repeats. Comb the hair with the effective tooth, straighten the collar that never meant harm, slip the coin under the lid coin warm from his palm coin that turns closed eyes from chance to choice. He hums very quietly, not because anyone hears, but because quiet itself likes a companion. At the back table stand the instruments of prevention, the pump with its tireless elbow, the glass syringe that always looks cool to the touch, even when it's been arguing with the lantern, the curved needle that mends like a whispered amend. He learned formulas from a traveling demonstrator who sold wintergreen, and promises from the back of a wagon, and found that if you reduce the promises, the wintergreen remains useful. Zinc chloride is the stern ant of the cupboard, preventing what it prevents without taking applause. A respectful mix of arsenical color brings back not pink exactly, but the memory of pink, which is kinder. In winter, when the road to Boot Hill grows longer without moving, he makes the solution a shade more persuaded. When summer forgets its manners, he lets the room be breezier, and the lantern's chimney collects moths that read themselves as stars. Sometimes he borrows church wine because it behaves better than river water at the necessary moments. He returns it with thanks and a modest pie, and the parson pretends not to notice that the exchange balances itself perfectly. On thin nights, supplies come thin as well, and he measures by eye with the accuracy of a man who has measured shadows for years. He stitches where the ride will jog, not to deceive, but to keep the road from making unkind remarks. He is careful with knots. Good knots admit nothing and confess nothing. In the margin of the ledger he once wrote, in very small letters, "The formula is not a miracle." It is patience that has learned arithmetic. He underlined nothing. Sleep, which is listening, nodded. Out under the wide syllables of the sky, Boot Hill stands with the steady humility of a broom put back on its hook. The hill is not steep, just committed. Stars hammer themselves into the dark with the confidence of nails. The wind is bilingual and gossips with grass in 2 languages. The Undertaker brings the shovel that has chosen him. He cuts turf with the practiced delicacy of a barber trimming a sideburn, and lays the green lid aside, square, respectful, so it will later fit without argument. The soil here offers a small survey course in geology. Shale chooses to snap, sand likes to test commitment, caliche rings pleasantly under steel. He gauges depth by the shovel's throat, not because he distrusts the measuring stick, but because the shovel and he have an understanding built on stubborn evenings. When help is needed, he hires drifters for the coin of the moment and the promise of coffee that stands up by itself in the cup. They dig companionably, a slow duet, until the coyotes start their editorial and it is time to smooth edges. If he digs alone, he sets the lantern on a rock like a judge whose robe is tired. He keeps a private map of the hill in his head, the kind of map without lines, just a walk of steps learned by wearing the same path until it remembers you. Wood markers face east so morning has something to read. Names are written in pencil because ink has a dramatically short memory outdoors. Now and then a winter storm persuades a row to lose its argument with weather. He can still find it in his mind, turn by the square rock that looks like a loaf, stop where the grass grows resentful, 3 steps shy of the cowpath that keeps changing its mind. Rights happen when someone has them. A Catholic murmur that sounds like water thinking. a German hymn that prefers humming and therefore is perfect. A Cheyenne song shared low and careful, which everyone else listens to by looking at the ground. If no rite presents itself, he conducts a small practical kindness, a matchbook under the left shoulder to keep the wind from reorganizing anyone. A harmonica reed in a pocket, a playing chip pressed between slats as unglamorous currency against forgetfulness. For the truly unclaimed, he writes a letter to no one in particular and slides it into the coffin like a receipt. Found, not lost. The coyotes pause long enough to remember they were once dogs. It is of no doctrinal significance. It simply helps. When morning begins to try the horizon on like a scarf, he smooths the turf back into place. He replaces the spade with the gentleness reserved for sleeping infants and barometers. He checks the fence posts 1, 2, 3 because fiddlers, children, and cattle all test fences out of principle. On the way down, he picks up a bottleneck that has been telling jokes to feet. He passes the school where the bell rings once to make sure it still can. The bakery opens its door and exhales a lecture on goodness that requires no footnotes. The town stretches, corrects its hat, and calls this process dawn. Back at the parlor, the ledger is waiting, ruled, believing. He writes receipts in the only style that receipts trust: narrow, legible, resistant to rain. Coffin boards from Johnson's mill-shaved, smooth, grudging discount acknowledged. Bleach in a bottle with a label that thinks it is a secret. Muslin by the yard, traded for shoe mending, which seems unfair but will make sense when winter decides to be theatrical. For the sheriff, he writes 2 versions of the same line, the coroner's certain one and the street's actual one, and keeps both in his desk until they finally resemble each other. In the space between columns, he keeps a few small portraits, out of faces, which are not his to store, but of hats, scars, and hands. A hat brim curved like a moon that refuses to lean. A scar traveling west across a knuckle before turning politely south. A hand calloused in the exact locations that explain how a life was carried. He is, without appointment, the town's registrar of tiny mercies. When a man has no money but a wife who makes superior biscuits, the ledger accepts biscuits as if they were minted by the bank. When a woman offers a jar of buttons with the solemnity of a notary, the ledger nods and writes, buttons accepted. Value, ongoing. When an old prospector insists on paying in dust that believes itself to be gold, he writes credited toward future errands, and nobody has to explain to the prospector anything that would shorten his day. He records the weather because weather has strong opinions about dignity. He records time because time is occasionally surprised to be noticed. He records, now and then, a sentence not meant for reading. Town requested gentleness today. Provided. There are 2 books, though only one has a title. The big ledger anyone may consult if their memory needs a brace. The small notebook, tucked behind the clock, simply labeled for quiet. In it he writes the details that do not want to become gossip. That the carpenter cried on the hill because his hammer slipped and nicked the new pine. That the gambler could recite poetry, but only when drunk and alone. That the school teacher put violets between pages of arithmetic and apologized when they left a stain as if arithmetic had feelings. He keeps the little notebook for days when someone asks, "What kind of place is this?" And he can, having read it, say truthfully, "Decent." Late at night, the cat returns to supervise the final sweeping. Sawdust piles obediently into its little drift. The lamp gives a last thoughtful blink and decides against it. He counts token coins, wraps the comb in cloth, the way you put a blanket over a chair, checks the wagon lamp once more, because checking once more is a local church in which he quietly believes. He comments to the room, "That will do," and the room agrees. There is a final knock sometimes, gentle as a thought. A ranch girl, hat in hand, to ask how deep a hole should be for a pet. A drifter, unexpectedly polite, to return a borrowed spade and a story about why it took a week. A weary father who does not want advice, just a table to sit at while he finds his breath. The Undertaker provides the table and a pencil, because pencils look like readiness. Near sunup, he steps out to the doorway with a cup of coffee that tastes like determination held at a drinkable temperature. He watches the day begin its slow arithmetic. The hill keeps its shape. The boardwalk complains in the same voice as yesterday. The deputy walks by and tips his hat as if it weighed more than the law. The Undertaker lifts the ledger, draws a single line under the last entry to tuck it in, and writes, in small-lettered calm, as needed. He closes the book, but not tightly, because a town always has one more word. If you have drifted into sleep by now, the parlor will continue speaking softly on your behalf. If you are still awake, you may notice how the smallest procedures make a wild place gentle. Coins warmed in a palm turf, replaced as if it were silk, a hymn hummed by someone who knows only the first 3 notes, and a column of tidy ink that turns chaos into sequence. And when the next night arrives, as it always does with professional punctuality, he will light the lamp again, and the room will grow quiet again, and the pencil will be sharpened to the courteous point that says, "We will take care of this." He will touch each tool like a neighbor. He will fold muslin into squares that look like certainty. He will mark the hill in his mind and his book, one name, one step, one stone at a time. There is here no grand conclusion, only the comforting repetition of things done properly. Dust settled, hinges oiled, water warmed, wintergreen persuaded, turf smooth, receipts written, dawn allowed. The town will sleep and wake. The ledger will open and close. The lamp will draw its patient circle on the counter. And somewhere, a cat will decide whether the night requires supervision. You might not expect the tidiest handwriting in town to belong to a man who spends his evenings counting nails and conversing with a lantern, but that is how the frontier liked to arrange its surprises, very neatly, with a small loop on the Y. Dusk folds over the boardwalks, and boots tap the floorboards like patient metronomes. Inside a modest room whose windows collect the day the way a pocket collects lint, the Undertaker lifts the glass chimney from a single brass lamp and polishes it until it. The flame looks like it has had a good night's sleep. He checks the wick with the thoughtful frown of someone evaluating a violin string. The room inhales warm light and becomes several shades more honest. Metal tools on the counter answer roll call shears, a bone saw, a razor with a careful edge, each tapped once and put back in its square, because a square is what evening understands best. He tightens the lid on the carbolic jar and does not open it. He knows the weight of a safe smell. He runs his palm over stacked boards that will become boxes and listens to the grain tell him something in wood syllables about patience. On the wall, a black cravat waits with the obedience of a bookmark. He ties it with the same knot every time, because knots behave if you offer them consistency. He opens the ledger leather bound, corners softened by responsible thumbs, and draws a line straight as a sermon down the middle of the new page. Columns sit there like well-behaved cousins at a Sunday dinner. Name when known, 'cause when not disputed. Belongings, a small theater of pockets. Burial plot, sketched on a hand map that looks like a thumbprint in pencil. Fee, often not a number, but a compact coffee, a ham, a future chore someone will remember to do. He writes the date, pauses for the mechanical pleasure of a period, and listens to the town edit itself quieter. The saloon piano decides it knows 6 notes and will continue knowing only those 6 notes indefinitely. A mule disputes the price of hay in precise mule-specific arguments. A coyote tries out the first syllable of a song and changes its mind. The Undertaker sharpens his pencil with 3 gentle turns. The shavings fall in a curl that resembles the letter E, the most industrious letter. If you're somehow still awake by the time we reach the paragraph about pocket watch engravings and goodness, what a thrill. I invite you to subscribe. But do not push yourself. The lamp is doing enough pushing for all of us. A knuckle raps on the door with the calm authority of a sheriff's deputy who has seen everything. Twice already and taken notes. He steps in, the dust following like an apprentice. Information arrives folded. Railway platform mishap, 2 miles out. A card game on the barber's back stoop that mislaid its mathematics. A wagon wheel that preferred an alternate route. The deputy leaves a paper and sometimes a small envelope containing coins that sound like official apologies. The Undertaker reads without comment, then writes without emotion. A man filling out the universe's forms with the correct ink weight. When the door clicks shut, the lamplight feels larger, like a sigh that has decided to be a room. He adds to the routine a soft inspection of the handcart and canvas stretcher. The rope knots look dependable, which is the highest compliment rope cares to hear. On a shelf above the hooks, his hat and coat wait with the patience of reliable weather. From a nail near the back door, a rosary makes its faint clicking sound a pocket-sized metronome for keeping your manners in time. The preparation room is not grand, nor is it cruel. It is tidy, and tidy turns out to be the most humane temperature. Lye soap sits in a row, smelling like clean decisions. A tin basin waits for warm water, not hot. Even in quiet states, the skin prefers moderation. The mirrors are shrouded with muslin because reflections have already worked all day and earned an evening off. Coins lighten his palm and are set gently where lids will someday rest. The edges have been filed smooth because discomfort has already had its portion. He lays the towel flat, aligns the razor with the comb, squares the small glass bottle whose label has more ambition than accuracy. Washing begins as a ritual and remains one. Breath finished, hemlines neatened, hair corrected into its best attempt at diplomacy. Hands crossed unless the life belonged to someone who never crossed their hands for anyone, and who should keep their habits even now. On a nail beside the door hangs a ribbon tied to a key to a lock to a desk where he keeps the town's unclaimed smallness. A locket with someone else's photograph. A folded theater ticket from a town 3 towns away. A paper button from a coat that did its best with insufficient thread. If there is family, everything is labeled in a square hand that refuses flourish. If there is not, he tucks a square of muslin into the pocket just so there is something there, a minimal courtesy extended to emptiness. He hums while he works, not a tune exactly, more the idea of a tune that the air can lean on. The pump stands nearby, patient as a farmhand. On the shelf, a glass syringe waits like a very calm icicle. He learned his formulas from a traveling gentleman who sold wintergreen and optimism from the back of a wagon. The wintergreen stayed useful after the optimism went home. Zinc chloride makes its firm politeness known. Arsenical color brings back not rose, which would be a lie, but the memory of rose, which is gentler. He stitches where the road will jostle, not to deceive, only to keep the ride from making commentary. Knots are small diplomats. They close negotiations without triumph dot when supplies run thin. He measures by weight and by feeling, like a cook who knows which part of the spoon a recipe truly lives on. He keeps a second notebook tiny, the kind a cricket could use for correspondence, where he writes only the figures of mixtures and the weather that accompanied them. 2 spoonfuls less in July, a note reads, because July has its own ideas. In winter, he warms the glass before the fluid meets it, which helps the solution behave like a citizen rather than a rumor. The water is always warmed to the temperature of a promise. He borrows small wine from the parson when necessary and returns it, if not in the same bottle, then in the shape of a pie. There is, in this room, a competence so quiet it could be mistaken for mercy. Beyond the door, Boot Hill sits above the town as if supervising the arrangement of roofs, which are forever committed to being slightly wrong. The path up is a patient climb. Even the wind walks. The grass is stiff, combed backward by weather. Stars hammer themselves into the dark with bright, practical nails. He brings the shovel that has chosen him, the one with a handle rubbed to the color of scents. He parts turf with the carefulness of someone folding a shirt for the last time, and lays it aside in a square that will later become a snug lid. Shale beneath bites when struck. Sand collapses with the enthusiasm of theater curtains. Kalish rings under the blade like crockery kept for Sundays. He checks depth against the shovel's throat because measuring sticks are fine tools. But trust belongs to things you have held through difficult seasons. If the grave must be finished by dawn, he hires a drifter or two, coffee promised and delivered black enough to carry its own luggage. Digging is a slow duet with the earth keeping time. Conversation runs toward weather, toward boots, toward a town 4 counties away that everyone claims to have disliked carefully. Coyotes watch from the rim, slightly offended by human ceremonies. The Undertaker knows each row by step instead of by number. Turn up the rock shaped like a loaf of bread. Stop before the grass begins to hold a grudge. 3 paces shy of the cowpath that keeps changing its mind. He sifts his memory as if it were a bag of seed, choosing each place for the shade it gives to the names. When families come, rituals happen in the languages available. A Catholic sign traced in the air like a bird that prefers rectangles. A German hymn humming along the low strings of evening. A Cheyenne chant shared quietly as if teaching the hill a tune it already knew. If there is no right, he adds a token under the left shoulder, a matchbook to moderate the wind's untidiness, a reed from a harmonica, a playing chip from the saloon, because even unclaimed lives deserve a placeholder in the pocket. Wooden markers face east so the hill can read the morning. Names are written in pencil. Ink has ideas in rain that pencil does not. For those the weather steals from the wood, he keeps a hidden map in his head, a geometry of steps and pauses that no storm can erase. He can find what the wind forgets. The town does not know it needs him for that, but it does. He has a mental footnote on each square of grass, a hat with a brim turned down in apology, a scar that goes west before politely heading south, a pair of hands that looked like they had held ropes and secrets. Morning climbs the horizon at an agreeable incline. The turf goes back with the certainty of a lid closing on a jar of jam. Fence posts are checked because fiddlers, children, cattle, and wind all test fences out of principle. On the walk downhill, he retrieves a bottleneck, a nail that wishes it were still a nail, and a story nevertheless worth carrying. The bakery opens and releases a breath of bread that forgives most of yesterday. Someone sweeps a stoop with the artistry of someone preparing a stage. The school bell rings once to see if it still can. Back in the parlor, lamp trimmed, the ledger waits as trustworthy as furniture. He totals quietly. The town still pays mostly in arithmetic and occasionally in casserole. Coffin boards from Johnson's mill, shaved and honest. Bleach that is more letter than liquid. Muslin by the yard, traded as the season requires, for shoe repair, eggs, or a parcel of rumor. He writes receipts carefully enough that even rain would hesitate to make a mess of them. For the sheriff, whose forms prefer certainty, he writes the coroner's version, and on another sheet, the streets. The 2 papers get along poorly for a while and then begin to resemble one another out of boredom. Between entries, he sketches unimportant portraits, a hat brim shaped like a thin moon, a scar traveling across a knuckle that looks like a mapped river, the exact tilt of a woman's smile, as if the mouth remembered laughter better than the face did. He is not an artist. He keeps good minutes. The ledger has a public tone. And then there is the little book behind the clock labeled only for quiet. This book records what the town forgets on purpose. The carpenter who cried on the hill because his hammer slipped and nicked the new pine. The gambler who recited poetry but only to stray dogs. The school teacher who pressed violets between pages of arithmetic and apologized for the stain as if numbers could be wounded. He copies none of these private facts into the big book. They are not for accountants. He keeps them for the days when someone asks from the doorway, "What kind of place is this?" And he can truthfully answer, most of the time decent. Payment is its own comedy. A woman with a jar of buttons believes she is offering currency. The ledger agrees, writing buttons value ongoing, and means it. A rancher arrives with a sack of potatoes and a promise to mend the fence the wind keeps editing. Both are accepted at their face value. A prospector insists on paying in dust that is very determined about being gold. The Undertaker writes credited toward future errands, which is exactly what it is. Sometimes payment is a story told without hurry in a chair that looks like it was built for listening. He writes story, draws a small square next to it, and fills the square in with patient diagonal lines. The column of fees turns into a sort of town quilt. Night leans once more into the windows, and the lamp lifts its chin. Sawdust is swept, making a small drift against the baseboard that looks almost like a shoreline. The shears are wiped, the needle returned to its moon on felt, the comb wrapped in muslin like a little violin. He checks the wagon again, because checking again is one of the frontier's quiet religions. The cat appears, tours the premises with the dignity of a civic inspector, and sits on the ledger as if to bless the sums. Sometimes there is a gentle knock, one of those late knocks that is as much question as sound. A ranch girl asking how deep a child should dig for a pet. A polite drifter returning a borrowed spade and a story about why it took a week. A father who needs a table to set his elbows on until he can breathe properly again. The Undertaker knows which chair to offer and which sentence to avoid. He is a connoisseur of silences that do better work than words. Near sunup, he steps outside with a cup of coffee that has negotiated a truce between bitterness and heat. The town unwrinkles gradually, a shirt taken from the line. The hill keeps its shape with excellent posture. The deputy walks by, tips his hat as if the hat weighs as much as the law, and keeps going. The Undertaker draws a single line under the last entry and writes in a small, tidy hand that cannot imagine a flourish, as needed. He does not close the book completely. A town always has one more sentence. The lamp gets pinched out with the gentleness owed to good employees. The room holds its breath pleasantly and puts the night away like folded laundry. If you are still awake, how determined of you can picture very easily how the evening will come again with its careful repetitions. The Undertaker will polish the lamp and check the wick as if it were a violin string in a quiet orchestra. He will arrange the tools in their squares as if squares were a moral instruction. He will turn water to the temperature of a promise and let soap speak its plain language. He will fold muslin into precision, not to impress anyone, but to keep order gentle. He will mark the hill in his mind and on his map, one step, one stone, one name at a time. And the town will be grateful without making a scene, which is its favorite way to be grateful. Nothing concludes here. Things simply continue to be done properly, dust settled, hinges oiled, turf replaced with great affection for rectangles, wintergreen persuaded, coins warmed in a palm, receipts written legibly enough to make Rain think twice, dawn aloud. The lamp will draw its patient circle again. The ledger will open, and then it will close, and then it will open. And somewhere, a cat will decide the night requires supervision and will take the job, without ceremony, as if it had always been the plan. You might not expect the calmest person in a boomtown to be the one who measures dust, but here we are, standing in a doorway where dust is a kind of clock, and a lantern is the only hour hand that matters. Evening leans over the street boards with the weight of a friendly cat, and the Undertaker, who answers to his name only when it's said softly, checks the lamp glass with the devotion other men reserve for sunrise. He polishes until the flame's reflection looks like a neat comma, the sort a schoolmaster would envy. The room inhales one breath of warm light and becomes domestic, almost polite. Tools laid out on the table clear their throats in the order they will sing. The shears that snip the raveled edge from a collar, the carefully honed razor that hums when it's pleased, the comb whose teeth know the geography of nearly every head in town. A jar labeled carbolic sits closed, radiating the responsible idea of being available. He oils hinges that were not squeaking, he squares a ruler that was already square, and he studies the level of the lamp oil as if it were a horizon in miniature. There is comfort in noticing things before they ask to be noticed. On the shelf by the door waits his black cravat, patient as a bookmark, a note to self written in cloth. Beside it, the leather ledger corners rounded by years of reasonable thumbs opens where the ribbon tells it to. He draws a line down the page so straight it deepens the room's moral character. Name when offered. Circumstance when agreed upon. Belongings, which are always more curious than anyone expects. Plot with a thumbnail map that looks like a tidy thunderbolt. Fee expressed generously, or in the currency of the frontier, which is to say, coffee, a ham, a promise, a future favor nobody will remember and yet will somehow fulfill. He writes the date, adds a period, and listens to the town subtract. The saloon piano chooses 4 notes tonight and maintains a loyal relationship with them. A mule offers commentary and then, satisfied, withdraws to consider hay. Wind slips under the door like a polite rumor and waits for permission to be a draft. If you're still awake by the time we get to the recipe for soap that doesn't mind river water, you're welcome to subscribe. It would be a quiet, considerate gesture, but please don't strain yourself. The lamp is already doing a spectacular job. A knock, deliberate and undecorated, arranges everything into the next part of the evening. The deputy steps in, hat brim, carrying a day's arithmetic. His report is not dramatic. Nothing in this room will allow it. A card game grew impatient and then contrite. A horse refused a second bridge. A stranger arrived, argued with height and gravity, and lost. The deputy places a folded sheet on the table and exactly 3 coins beside it, which clink with the dignity of small, official apologies. The Undertaker nods once, not because authority requires it, but because the ledger likes acknowledgement. He writes a new line without looking at his hand. The lamp adjusts its little weather. Then he sets out the stretcher and the canvas, checks the rope knots that he tied earlier with the practical tenderness of a sailor in a dry country, and lays the handcart's handle in his palm to confirm its nickname. All tools have nicknames in buildings like this. This one is steady, nothing complicated. Steadiness is the whole project. The preparation room could be mistaken for a kitchen if the recipes were written in whispers. Tin basin. Bar of lye soap with a ridgeline like a mountain that believes in cleanliness. Towels folded to the dimensions of quiet. The mirrors are draped with muslin not because anyone is superstitious, though everyone is, but because reflections work a long day and are allowed an evening off. Coins warm in his pocket before they are set gently where lids will later rest. He files the edges smooth because hard edges have already done their duty. Washing is careful and unhurried, a conversation with water at the temperature of promise. Hands crossed if the life would have liked that. Hands resting broad and undecided if the life never asked permission for anything, even now. He trims a beard that wants to be respectable, combs hair into a part that aims for the railroad timetable, straightens a collar that has lived in a world full of wind. If pockets are empty, he tucks a square of muslin into one, because even absence looks better when it has something small to look. After Dot, the pump offers water with the generational wisdom of iron. The handle squeaks exactly where memory expects it to squeak. On a shelf, he keeps a traveling demonstrator's formulas copied in the tidy script of someone who admires tidy scripts. Zinc chloride for firmness that isn't boastful. Wintergreen to persuade the room to step back from unkind truths. Arsenical colors used with the restraint you save for adjectives. A glass syringe, so calm it seems to apologize for being a syringe, glints when turned just so. He measures by weight in winter and by habit in summer, because July has opinions about arithmetic. He keeps a second notebook half the size of a hand, quarter of an argument, where he notes mixtures and weather. Less than dry wind, one line says. More in Chinooks, says another. This book has no names, only temperature and patience. He learned the craft from a man who called himself doctor because he owned a hat with a feather. The wintergreen outlasted the hat. When the work asks for stitches, he answers with thread that doesn't wish to be celebrated. Knots are small diplomats. They bring edges to the same table and remind them to be neighbors. He doesn't conceal what cannot be concealed. He simply encouraged the world to be gentle. If the body will travel over ruts, he adds a line or two of quiet persuasion to keep peace in the jostle. If it will stay in town, he lets the cloth lie flat as a calm afternoon. He hums not a tune exactly, more the idea of a tune. Something a kettle would sing if it decided to become philosophical. In one drawer he keeps a jar of buttons because buttons are the frontier's autobiography. When families come, he can sometimes match a missing cuff to a better memory. When nobody comes, the buttons still wait. They have patience, which is the first rule of hardware and the last rule of mercy. The hill above town wears the evening like a respectable coat. Grass combed north by the wind holds its posture against opinion. If you climb slowly and the hill prefers that you do, you can feel the clay shift from mutter to conversation. The Undertaker brings the shovel that suits him, wraps it lightly on the heel like a dog greeting a familiar boot, and chooses a spot that satisfies both the map and the longer map he keeps in his feet. He cuts the turf with the carefulness of someone promising to put it back exactly as found. Under the green, the soil begins to change dialects. Shale bites like a small, practical animal. Sand collapses in enthusiastic folds. Koi shrinks like crockery kept for good company. He measures depth against the throat of his shovel rather than a stick, because the shovel understands context and a stick is merely talented. Coyotes loiter on the rim as critics do, offering comment and then disclaiming authorship. Stars begin hammering themselves into the sky with bright nails. The wind supervises. Sometimes there is company for the digging. A drifter paid in coffee of the honest sort. An uncle who needs his hands to be busy while his mouth keeps a promise to silence. The work is all rhythm throw, breathe, fold, tamp until the earth agrees to the shape. When the ground is ready, he stands a moment and reviews the vocabulary of the hill. The first row holds the first winter, which nobody minded until they did. The second row contains a man who could recite the timetables in both directions and a woman who could settle a colt with one sentence. Near the cedar, the grave of a boy who learned to spell his name the week he needed it on a slate. Near the path, a gambler who pretended to dislike dogs and failed convincingly. He does not say any of this aloud. The hill has an ear for quiet. Ceremonies arrive in more voices than a church collection. The Catholic sign of the cross traces a practical compass in the air. A German hymn steps with the patience of heavy boots on a wooden floor. A Cheyenne chant lays out words that look like a river when you close your eyes. If there is no ceremony, he offers a token under the left shoulder to steady the weather. A matchbook, because the wind respects matches. A harmonica reed, because silence likes accompaniment. A gaming chip, because chance attends every event, whether invited or not. Wooden markers face east, so the morning can read the names first. Names, when they exist, are written in pencil. Pencil understands winter and negotiates with rain. For the unclaimed, he adds a small notation to the map in his head, 2 steps north of the stone shaped like a sleeping dog, 3 steps west of the patch of stubborn yarrow. He will be able to find them even when the hill pretends it cannot dot by starlight. The hill looks like an inventory of patience. He tampers the last edge, sets the turf lid gently, and wipes the shovel clean because tools appreciate compliments. The fence is inspected, not out of suspicion, but because fences enjoy being included. Somewhere lower down, a coyote attempts a soliloquy and decides instead to gnaw a weathered bone of logic. Lanterns travel down the path at a pace that refuses to advertise urgency. Back at his table, he will record the place not as a number, but as directions in the alphabet of feet. Others prefer lot and plot. He writes, turn by the loaf-shaped stone, stop before the wind grows conversational. It is, in its method, absurd. It is also accurate. Nothing on the hill gets lost except on purpose. Late nights lean on the parlor windows like old friends who prefer the porch. The ledger enjoys its moment. He totals the day's arithmetic, which speaks fluent barter. One family pays in a sack of potatoes with opinions. Another pays with a promise to repair a hinge the wind keeps editing added to the column under future kindness, which, incidentally, is the fullest column in the book. The prospector pays in dust that may or may not remember how to be gold, and the Undertaker writes credited towards stories, which is the fairest exchange available. He writes receipts in a hand so legible that even rain would hesitate to smudge it. The sheriff receives 2 versions of each scene, the courthouse certainty and the street story. He places them in separate envelopes so they won't fight in the drawer. Between entries, his pencil drifts into sketches, not portraits, exactly, more field notes of faces. The angle of the hat brim like the first crescent moon. A scar wandering an ear like a river that changed its mind. Fingers that have learned rope the way others learn grammar. There is also the little book kept behind the clock, which is labeled only for quiet. Here he writes things that do not belong to accounts. The baker who has set extra rolls on the sill the week a family forgot how breakfast works. The drummer who played a lullaby out behind the livery when the foal wouldn't rest. The woman who brushed her husband's jacket 3 times after the service because habit is a kind of prayer. He never reads this book to anyone. It steadies his hands when the knight asks him to pour coffee with good aim. Payment in kind continues, with the dignity of odd arithmetic. Buttons arrive in a jar. He accepts them as if they were coins because, to jackets and vests, they actually are. A child brings a paper fan creased into loyalty and places it on the table, then curtsies to the ledger because the ledger looks like it appreciates curtsies. He enters fan applies to summer. A rancher offers 2 fence posts in credit, which is exactly the currency the hill needs next month. The ledger does not judge. It collects the town's ways of saying thank you and arranges them into polite rows. When the hour grows thin and the lamp glass needs its last polish, he tidies the room as if morning were an honored guest. Sawdust swept into a line so straight it becomes a suggestion to the baseboard. Shears wiped, needle returned to its crescent moon of felt, comb wrapped in muslin like a violin bow resting between songs. The cat performs a tour of inspection, pauses to stare at an invisible thought, kneads the ledger with administrative pause, then settles in a coil shaped like an opinion. Sometimes there is a gentle knock. A girl with questions about how deep a pet prefers its garden bed. A man who needs a chair that does not require conversation. A drifter who brings back a borrowed spade and a rumor about rain. The Undertaker knows which chair fits which story and which kettle, understands which silence. Toward morning, the town unwraps itself. First, the faint cough of the bakery, starting its mathematics. Then the slow burr music out on the boardwalk. Then, far off, the fragile metallic laugh of a pail at the well. The hill above holds its posture. He steps outside with coffee that has negotiated a truce between bitterness and heat. The deputy passes, tips his hat as if the hat contains a small library, and asks after the wind. The Undertaker says the wind is doing fine work. Back at the table, he draws a single neat line under the last entry and writes, in a small hand that does not imagine flourishes, as needed. It isn't an ending, only a sentence that agrees to wait. The day will come again, in its dependable ridiculousness, precisely as it likes to. The lamp will offer its careful comma of light. The wick will be trimmed as if it were a violin string in a midnight orchestra, and the tools will settle into their appointed squares where squares feel safe. He will check the water for its promised temperature and the soap for its good manners. He will gather wintergreen and restraint, remind the thread to be diplomatic, and borrow exactly the right amount of patience from the quiet. On the hill, he will measure by shovel throat and by breathing, turning the turf precisely, tamping it back as if lids mattered, which of course they do. He will add tokens under left shoulders, small arguments against weather, and he will write pencil names that the morning can read without rubbing its eyes. The ledger will fill with the local economy of kindness buttons, fence posts, stories, and the little book will gather exactly those moments that are too useful for accounting. A voice that carried a hymn farther than it needed to. A hand that smoothed a sleeve twice, the way wind sometimes pauses at the door as if asking to come in. And as the lamp draws its circle steady, ordinary, merciful, the town will climb inside it with its boots, its manners, its errors, and its very good intentions, and get some rest. You might not expect the quietest job in a noisy frontier town to involve this much polishing of glass. But the Undertaker knows that a clean lamp is half the work of evening. He holds the chimney up to the last pale stripe of daylight and turns it until the smudges confess. The lamp doesn't flare when he lights it. It blooms like a well-mannered flower that arrived on time and brought its own sunshine. On the bench, tools line up with the discipline of soldiers and the gossip of spoons. The tiny scissors that trim threads too proud for their station. The razor that sings one polite note when its edge is perfect. The comb whose teeth know every road a strand of hair might choose. A shallow dish of carbolic rests nearby, smelling not exactly pleasant, but very sure of itself. The way a strict schoolteacher is sure of chalk. The Undertaker oils a hinge that wasn't squeaking just to keep it in practice. Checks the wick height as if the flame might sit for an exam, and smooths a wrinkle from the black cravat that waits atop the ledger like a bookmark for dignity. The ledger itself is a small geography of the town. Each page carries fences of lines, little fields where certainty grows. He draws this evening's first column with a rule so straight it could convince a river to behave. Name, if there is one. Circumstance, stated plainly or wrapped in cotton depending on the listener. Place, which is sometimes a number and sometimes a set of directions like 2 steps. Beyond the stone that looks like a loaf of bread. Belongings, always more revealing than anyone expects. A pewter thimble. A dog-eared dime novel whose hero is always 5 minutes late. A watch that ticks obediently even now as if the hour were its private hobby. Fee, which may appear in coins or potatoes with opinions, or the promise that someone will finally repair the church hinge. If you're still awake by the time we get to the recipe for soap that behaves even in river water, you're welcome to subscribe quietly without sudden movements. But truly don't fuss. The lamp prefers you drowsy. A knock that knows how not to echo arrives on the door. The deputy steps in with a hat brim that has seen every argument this town can organize. He speaks in the reliable vocabulary of the job. A scuffle, a fall, a stubborn horse, a card that claimed to be an ace when it was only practicing. He places 3 coins and a folded report on the table, where they arrange themselves into a small still life called regret. The Undertaker nods once. The ledger accepts a new line the way a well-kept garden accepts an evening watering. He ties the black cravat in a knot that could educate younger knots, lifts the stretcher handles to verify their name, steady, as always, and tests the handcart's one polite squeak. The cat, who keeps an unsalaried post as moral inspector, blinks at the scene and approves it into being Dot in the preparation room. The mirrors are draped in muslin, not because reflections are unwelcome, but because they work long hours and deserve an early night. The tin basin gleams with simple ambition. He pumps water that knows the deep grammar of iron and winter, then adjusts the temperature until steam rises in a handwriting anyone could read. Washing begins as a ritual and continues as a kindness. Hands cross neatly if the life valued neatness. They rest broad and undecided if the life preferred stubborn weather. A flicker of lather travels the jaw the way a small cloud travels a hill. The comb cooks his hair into a line you could set your watch by. If there is a locket, he tucks it back where the heart remembers it. If there is only an empty pocket, he grants it a folded square of muslin so absence can feel looked after. On a shelf waits a small congregation of labeled bottles, the sermons of a traveling demonstrator copied in a clerk's patient hand. Zinc chloride for firmness that doesn't brag. Wintergreen to persuade the room to be honest but not cruel. Arsenical colors used lightly as one uses adjectives around shy company. A glass syringe glints like a truthful word. The Undertaker measures by weight in winter and by habit in summer, because July has opinions about precision. He has a notebook half the size of a palm where each mixture is traced to weather, not to names. Less on windy nights, one line offers. More when the ground sulks. The book smells faintly of wintergreen and arithmetic. Sometimes the work requires stitches. He sets the needle to its small diplomacy, drawing edges to the same table and persuading them to be neighbors. Knots are tied with the confidence of sailors who learned on slower seas. If the road to the hill promises ruts, he adds a discreet line or two of reinforcement. If the distance is short and the night calm, he lets the cloth lie flat as noon. He hums while he works, not a tune, exactly, but the idea of a tune something the kettle might try if it felt poetic. In a drawer rests a jar of buttons, a census of jackets. Mothers recognize them. Widowers hold them like coins from a remembered country. For the unclaimed, a button will be slipped into a pocket anyway. Pockets appreciate being asked to participate. Outside, the town performs its bedtime opera. The saloon piano rehearses the same 4 notes and is proud of the improvement. A mule coughs and decides he has contributed all he intended. Farther off, a coyote auditions a monologue, then settles for philosophy. The Undertaker listens because listening is part of the craft. The night tells him how much patience the work will want. He checks the lantern glass clear, flame trimmed, and sets off toward the hill. Hill sits above the town like an uncle who sees further mostly because he stands up. Grass combed north by the wind holds a posture that would impress a school board. The path is the kind you respect by walking it slowly. Gravel at the edge clicks like soft ice. At the gate, the Undertaker rests his hand on the top board, not exactly as a prayer and not exactly as a habit, but as the handshake he gives each evening to the hill that keeps everyone's secrets. He chooses a spot that satisfies both the map folded in his pocket and the larger map he keeps in his feet. The shovel is shaped for this work and knows it. He wraps it lightly on his boot heel the way you greet an old instrument. Digging has a rhythm older than logic. He cuts the turf first, promising it a return ticket. Beneath the green, the soil speaks in dialects. Shale bites shoes like a polite dog. Sand collapses in small applause. Kalish rings like crockery set out for company. He measures not with a wooden rod, but with the throat of the shovel, which understands context. If the ground is hard with the memory of August, he hires a drifter to help and pays in coffee that forgives the kettle. If the ground is reluctant because it remembers March, he digs a little deeper and argues less. The coyotes gather at the rim, as critics do, all posture and commentary, and then lose interest in favor of ordinary bones. Stars appear with the tidy punctuality of an inventory, nailing themselves to the sky one bright nail at a time. Ceremony comes in as many versions as there are ways to pronounce Amen. Tonight, a Catholic crosses the waxy air with a steady hand. Last week, a German hymn walked the hill in boots and found its way back to the gate without looking down. Some nights a Cheyenne chant arrives like water, word after word rounded by distance. When there is no ceremony, the Undertaker provides a token something light for the left shoulder, the weather's tenderest battlefield. A matchbook, because storms respect objects that make their own light. A harmonica reed, because silence chooses companions. A gaming chip, because chance attends uninvited and deserves to be recognized at least once. Markers are cut from local wood and face where the morning begins, so the sun can perform the day's first reading. Names are written in pencil. Pencil takes correction, and weather is a great editor. The hill keeps its own ledger. Row 1 is the first winter, when everyone pretended not to mind the cold, and then minded suddenly. Row 2 contains the gambler who could shuffle silence, the midwife whose hands remembered more birthdays than anyone else, and a blacksmith who believed every problem could be solved with heat and persuasion and was mostly correct. Near the cedar is a boy who learned the letter J and wrote it everywhere because he liked the tale. The Undertaker doesn't recite these to anyone. He knows them as a baker knows the temperature of an oven by the way it breathes. He sets the last clod gently and makes the turf lid fit so neatly that even the wind pauses to admire, returning. Down the path he notices small, loyal details. The fence staples hold even where the post wishes to lean. A cricket insists upon an encore. The town below begins to flicker with lamps that agree to be stars for those who prefer lower constellations. At the parlor, he sets the shovel by the door in its customary place where it can hear what is said. The cat, who has been administering the inventory of warmth, circles once on the ledger and then curls just off the edge because boundaries are valuable. Under lamplight, the ledger resumes its authority. Coins are counted softly, so arithmetic won't wake the chairs. Tonight there are 3 silver pieces of immaculate behavior, a wrap of paper currency with a faint smell of peppermint, and the sketch of a horse owed in springtime. He records them all in the same patient script, and then continues down the column into the land of barter. Hinge repair church south door. 2 fence posts sound. Sack of potatoes opinionated. Jar of buttons assorted. A boy will arrive tomorrow with a paper fan folded as neatly as a promise. He will enter that as summer credit. A rancher will offer fence stretching expertise. That will be labor against weather. The ledger does not snicker. It believes commerce is the language a town speaks when it wants to be polite. He writes 2 versions of the sheriff's report, one that satisfies the courtroom and one that remembers the street. Altercation near the bridge. No horse truly at fault. Card fell between planks. Opinions differed on whether it counted. Bottle argued gravity and proved correct. He places them in separate envelopes so they won't quarrel. Between entries his pencil drifts into sketches, never faces whole. Only leading edges, the tilt of a hat brim like a shrub. The exact geography of a scar that traveled from jaw to ear like a river that loved detours. The shallow crescent at the corner of a widow's mouth where good manners hide. Griefed out behind the clock, he keeps a smaller book called For Quiet. It has no columns. Only sentences that won't behave inside accounting. He writes, Baker left 2 extra rolls on the sill the week the town forgot breakfast. He adds, Fiddler played a lullaby to the horses until they forgave thunder. He writes, Woman brushed her husband's sleeve 3 times after the service. Habit is a kind of prayer. This book doesn't balance anything. It just keeps the fragile parts from evaporating. Night leans deeper. The lamp glass gets a final polish that could teach mirrors how to mind their own reflections. Tools return to their square shears, razor, comb each tucked into its felt crescent as if the table were a sky and they were small moons at proper distance. Sawdust is swept into a line straight enough to make the baseboard sit up straighter. The kettle declares itself available. Sometimes there's a knock no louder than a consideration. A girl needs advice about how deep a garden bed should be for a dog who preferred the apple tree. A man returns a borrowed spade and leaves a rumor about rain folded into thanks. A stranger offers a wordless nod and a handful of walnuts, which enter the ledger under unexpected but acceptable. He sits a while with the ledger, open to the day's last line, and writes, in small, careful letters that do not wish to be dramatic, as needed. It's not a conclusion. It's a willingness. Coffee lives in a chipped blue cup that has known more dawns than it can count. He opens the door for the night to step in or out as it prefers. The breeze carries a scent of dust that has accomplished things. Across the street, a lamp in the sheriff's office yawns. Somewhere beyond, a rooster misreads the situation and offers a practice announcement. Sleep belongs to towns the way silence belongs to fields. Still, there is one more round, because mercy does better when it stretches its legs. He walks to the hill again, not out of duty went to bed long ago, but because the stars look better if someone admires them. At the gate, he checks the latch and speaks to the fence post that wants reassurance. In the new row, the turf settles as if remembering its former job. The marker waits for morning's handwriting lesson. He places a flat stone beside the path to remind his boots of the step where the dirt pretends to be deeper. These are the sorts of improvements that never make speeches and always work. On the walk back, he studies the sky like a ledger that forgot its lines and decided to be generous. The town inhales. Bread will happen soon, and so will brooms, and so will the small clatter of a milk pail questioning a well. He ties off the lamp wick at last and watches the flame consider retirement. It folds into itself without drama, the way a courteous guest leaves a party. The room relaxes into the kind of darkness that remembers where the furniture lives. He sits for a breath at the threshold and lets the chair memorize him. Morning arrives in pencil before it commits to ink. He boils water that insists on being seen. He warms his hands around the cup and reviews the day's weather as if it were a polite acquaintance. The deputy will come by with further arithmetic. A farmer will trade fence wire for the certainty of a place. The cat will conduct an inspection that includes, for reasons known only to cats, the top of the ledger and the corner of the window where dust collects stories. He will update the little book under the clock with something the world almost missed. And when the next knock comes soft, contrite, unreasonable, ordinary, he will lift the lantern again and tidy the night so it can rest. This is what the town asks of him. Small adjustments to the hinge of the world. A clean lamp, buttons counted like coins, stitches that behave, and the exact knowledge of where the wind becomes conversational. It is not a dramatic post. It is not supposed to be noticed, but it holds. And the hill above nods in agreement, wearing its tidy rows and its map of footsteps, keeping its ledger of weather and patience, and letting everyone sleep a little longer. You might not expect the quietest person in a loud frontier town to be the one who keeps the lights trimmed and the ledger straight, but the Undertaker of Boot Hill has always liked contradictions that mime their manners. He begins at dusk as the street loses its color and keeps only its shape. Boots huff dust across the boardwalk as if the boards were a harmonica. The Undertaker wipes the lantern chimney until he can count the ridges of his thumb through the glass. A good lantern, he says to no one, is like a trustworthy rumor bright enough to be useful, dim enough to behave. He lines his tools as if the table were a small parade ground, shears that snip only when spoken to, comb, razor, linen folded into squares with corners so crisp you could butter them. and a squat bottle of carbottle that smells convinced rather than friendly. He checks the handcart's one polite squeak and the stretcher's handles, which he calls steady and again because every evening deserves something memed twice. If you're still awake by the time, I describe the difference between long wicks and short wicks, and I will feel free to subscribe or merely intend to. Intention counts in sleepy places. He ties his black cravat with a knot that could lecture other knots about commitment, and turns to the ledger. The book is a plain thing, but it has ambitions. Columns stand like fence posts: name, belongings, cause, plot, fee, note to self. He writes in the same hand he uses for sermons that never leave his mouth. The townspeople appear on the page in miniature: the barber with opinions about winter, the rancher who swears by fence wire as others swear by poetry, the schoolmistress who grades weather like homework. Every line receives a date, because days like to be remembered, even when they've spent themselves on wind and splinters. Some entries include barter hinge repair, a bushel of potatoes with remarkable self-confidence, a red harmonica reed that claims to know only one tune. Some include coins that clink as if practicing manners. The ledger records, each with equal calm. The cat, who has taken a non-paying position as inspector of coroners, sits on the top right as though punctuation needs supervision. The knock when it comes is always the same, a sound that knows how to be heard but not echoed. The deputy enters carrying dust on his hat brim as though it paid rent. He explains, in a voice practiced at not alarming furniture, that the evening has developed a situation: a wagon wheel that argued successfully with a rut, a gun that disagreed with patience, a card that misrepresented itself and was corrected by consensus. He leaves 3 coins, cool moths, in the Undertaker's palm, and a folded note that asks for efficiency without saying so. The Undertaker nods and writes one more line in the ledger, a soft line with the weight of a sigh. He lifts the lantern, which has been waiting like an obedient small son, and steps into the street where night has begun writing in cursive. Saloon lamps wink from behind lace, and the piano considers a melody and chooses reconsideration. Back in the preparation room, the mirrors are draped. Not for superstition, exactly, though everyone has a personal agreement with superstition the way they have one with coffee. The cloth over the glass looks like a carefully kept silence. Tin basin, bar of soap, 2 towels, a brush so honest you'd trust it with arithmetic. Water, cold at first and then coaxed warm with buckets of negotiation, goes dimly gold under the lantern as if remembering wheat. Washing is not complicated work, but it does require attention. Forehead smoothed, eyelids greeted like acquaintances, hands crossed if that suits the memory of the person, hands open if they were more talkative in life. He hums when he works, not a hymn and not a tune you could publish, something between kettle and lullaby. When he lifts a locket from a pocket, he replaces it and tucks the cloth so it won't jostle on the hill road. If no keepsake presents itself, he folds a square of muslin and leaves it in the pocket anyway. Pockets like to be trusted with things. On a narrow shelf, a row of labeled bottles stands at attention like a chemical choir. Zinc chloride for firmness that doesn't brag. Wintergreen for a room that wants truth but not harshness. Color that behaves like a whispered compliment. There's a glass syringe, a needle threaded with patience and twine, which is the world's way of reminding us that knots can be gentle. These formulas traveled with a demonstrator who visited the town once in summer and swore by science while carrying a Bible. The Undertaker tested them long after the wagon rolled on. He drew a chart in a pocket notebook, not of people but of weather, less when the wind is a gossip, more when soil sulks, none on nights that already smell like memory. He works slowly, not because slowness is holy, though it may be, but because it is accurate. When stitches are necessary, he uses the smallest ones the needle allows. They are so neat you could wash them with your thumb. He favors a knot called the clove hitch, partly because clove seems a friendly word, and partly because he learned it from a sailor who traded him the trick for 2 cups of coffee and the news from Nebraska. Occasionally, there is mending of a jacket or shirt collar, where a life's occupation worn at the edge asks to be told to rest. He sets a button with a certainty that would impress a judge. The jar of buttons is its own census, brass from a uniform that served ambition more than authority, bone from a ranch coat that knew all the fences, mother of pearl that still asks politely to be admired, outside town noises practice distance. A mule scandalized by nothing announces his innocence. A coyote edits his own speech. The wind moves along Main Street like a deacon, encouraging everyone to sit closer. The Undertaker wipes the lantern once more and goes out to where Boot Hill sits above the town, like a guardian who prefers. Quiet Taka Hill keeps honest hours. Grass bends north because the wind insisted all spring. The path lifts gently enough to persuade rather than command. At the gate, he lays his hand on the top slat, a greeting not exactly to the hill or to the evening, but to the truce that lives between them. The shovel asks to be useful, and he obliges. Turf is cut like a lid, lifted whole, and set to one side on a patient blanket of sage. The soil announces its character in a litany he has learned like a creed. Shale bites. Sand collapses cheerfully. Kalish rings like dishes put away at a decent hour. Coyotes watch from the rim with the same attitude as critics who will not write and cannot help themselves. Stars nail themselves one by one into the dark, tight as well-set buttons. He measures depth with the shovel's throat and with the kind of memory that lives in the ankles. If the story calls for ceremony, he welcomes it. A priest murmurs to the air until the air feels forgiven. A German hymn arrives with sturdiness and leaves with it too. A Cheyenne chant winds through the sagebrush and counts time the way wind counts it round and round, then through. Sometimes there is only the Undertaker, the shovel, and the hill, and that counts as ceremony enough. He places a small token under the left shoulder for storms, a matchbook with 2 sticks still brave, a red harmonica reed on nights that want music but cannot afford it, a gaming chip when chance has been meddlesome. Wooden markers are sawed and set to face the morning. The sun likes to read names aloud when it rises. Pencil writes first because pencil listens to correction. Later, if the weather approves, he burns letters into cedar with a file warmed over the lantern flame, the smoke spelling sincerity. The rows are tidy, not stiff. He knows where everyone is. Row 1 is the winter, when the town pretended not to be surprised by snow, and was surprised anyway. Row 2 contains a gambler who could shuffle silence, a midwife who attended 3 sets of twins and 1 particularly stubborn calf, and a school teacher whose reading list included the sky. Near the cedar is the boy who had learned to loop a capital J with flourish and spent one joyful afternoon writing it on every available board. The Undertaker carries these in his head the way a baker carries oven times. He doesn't need to look, but he does, because respect is the difference between remembering and assuming. When the last spade is pressed, the turf lid returns to its seat as if the day itself were closing a book. He smooths the seams with the back of the shovel. 2 strokes north, 1 south, a soothing pattern learned from combing horses. He places a flat stone at the low step where the path enjoys pretending to be steeper, a marker for sleepy feet. He nods once to the hill and starts back while the crickets tune themselves to the key of patience dot in the parlor again. Lamplight climbs the walls like a very slow vine. The ledger waits open, square as a porch. He totals what the evening has given, the 3 coins from the deputy, 2 nickels offered by a boy who owed the town a favor he couldn't name, a promise of fence repair when the ground thaws, a pouch of tobacco that counts as money because everyone says so. He records the exchange as if the currency were uniform. The book respects jam, tobacco, and iron just as it respects silver. On a shelf behind the clock, he keeps a smaller book for sentences that won't fit in columns. He writes, "Baker left 2 extra rolls on the sill in case morning arrived tired." He writes, "Fiddler played to the horses after thunder. 3 ears rotated to listen." He writes, "Woman at the gate brushed her husband's sleeve 3 times." The exact rhythm of habit. These entries have no totals. Their arithmetic is a private language. He drafts 2 reports of the deputy's incident. One is for law, sturdy and uninspired, the kind of paragraph that sweeps its porch. The other is for memory and contains the useful parts. The creak of the bridge plank that always argues, the way the bottle chose gravity with enthusiasm, the card that fell half through a crack and became ambiguous. He places them in separate envelopes to prevent quarrel. Between sentences, he sketches a hat brim tilted like a shrug, the lace edge of a glove that remembered its dance lesson, a scar that curled from jaw to ear, like a river that considered but did not accept maps. Tools return to their corners, each to the velvet crescent that remembers them. The room is swept. Sawdust makes a tiny shore along the baseboard. The lantern chimney receives its nightly polish so it won't forget how. On the wall, the shadow of the razor confesses to being just a shadow. The Undertaker lets the lamp burn low, a small moon with good posture, and sits at the threshold with coffee that believes in the persistence of heat. He listens for the sounds that say the town has decided to sleep, the last piano chord practiced and put away, the receding hoofbeats of a horse who wanted to be important for one more block, the cough of the stove across the street as it settles into its own night. Sometimes a knock arrives even then. It is not urgent and never loud, the way a regret arrives on a polite day. A rancher asks if the hill still has room near the cedar for a wife who liked the sound the wind makes in that tree. A girl needs advice on digging a garden bed for the dog who preferred the shade beneath the porch. A stranger leaves a bundle of walnuts with a nod, so precise it could be a bow. Each occupies a line in the ledger, reservation row by cedar, garden depth 2 hands and 1 kindness, walnuts unexpected, therefore appreciated. If you've drifted by now, that's all right. The page will keep without you. It enjoys being read by the lamp alone. Night keeps doing what nights do, folding itself, unfolding again, adjusting the edges. He sleeps in a chair as long as a candle, wakes when the clock forgets to tick, and goes out once more to the gate of the hill, because sometimes morning begins early and needs company. He checks the latch with the same hand he used the evening before. The grass holds dew as if saving up for the day. The newest marker faces east with the expression of a student confident about the test. He pats the turf and says nothing, which is the correct thing to say. On the way back, he picks up a loose nail from the boardwalk and drops it into a jar labeled in case. The jar is nearly full. This pleases him. Preparedness is a kind of hymn. The sky changes its mind from charcoal to slate to paper. Bread happens down the street, a quiet industry that believes butter is an argument it can win. The blacksmith's forge blinks itself awake. Roosters, never fully informed, hold meetings about the hour. He pours the first water of the day into the basin and lets steam write a paragraph he won't need to read. Tools are inspected not for their glamour. There isn't any, but for the simple way they do what they were made to do. The razor hums like a wire fence in wind. The comb lies with its teeth aligned, the sort of order that keeps a town from rattling apart. He tightens a screw on the stretcher, says good morning to the cat, and opens the door wide enough for luck to wander in if it has business nearby. And so the day repeats the useful parts. The ledger's pen stands ready to testify. The lamp, its glass clear enough to pass judgment, waits for dusk. The hill looks down as though the town were a book. It has read many times and still enjoys for the page where the wind turns. The Undertaker hums the tune that isn't a tune. counts buttons that carry the weight of unremarkable heroism, and straightens the stack of towels as though tidiness were a code by which civil people recognize each other. If mercy requires an extra round after sundown, he will make it. If the deputy knocks before the coffee decides to be brave, he will answer. And if sleep is what you wanted from all these details, the wick height, the wintergreen, the respectful knots, then keep it. The lamp will mind itself a while. The hill will keep its rose. The ledger will hold steady lines until the next soft knock, barely louder than weather, asks to be written down.